from? Your bed, your couch, the middle of your 5th existential crisis of the week. I want to know. Also, are you wearing socks right now? No reason, just important scientific research. Today, we're about to ruin your ancient Chinese dream life. You thought waking up for your 9 to 5 was bad. Oh buddy, try 1600 BC, no coffee, a boss who thinks he's the literal son of heaven, and your main career goal is die slightly less painfully than your neighbour. So, welcome to ancient China, Shang Dynasty. If you're feeling OG, Han Dynasty if you want to feel slightly fancier while still living a life of constant fear and splinters. Now pick your character. Farmer, merchant, scholar or noble. Doesn't really matter. You're still waking up miserable. If you're a farmer, congratulations. You woke up at 4 AM to the sound of your neighbour coughing up a lung because life expectancy is a generous, maybe 35 if you're lucky. Your bed? It's not really a bed. It's a pile of straw, vaguely shaped like disappointment. You crawl out from under your itchy, bug-infested blanket, step into your mud floor house, and immediately smash your foot into a sharp rock. Good morning, pain. Breakfast? If you're rich, you're not. Maybe some millet porridge. If you're normal, it's rice. If you're unlucky, it's yesterday's cold rice, with a side of sadness. Then it's straight to the fields to work 12 hours bending over in soul-crushing humidity. Also, the local lord can collect 90% of your harvest and say, "Good job, peasant. Here's a lovely backhand to the face. No days off, no weekends, no self-care Sundays. Just dirt, sweat, and hope that the next flood doesn't wash away your entire existence. Yay, farming. If you're a merchant, ooh, fancy. You have money. You wake up on an actual bed. It's still hard as a rock, but at least it's not covered in bugs. You stretch, put on your linen robes, which by the way scream "I'm doing well" louder than a modern guy renting a Lambo for Instagram, and you start thinking about how to hustle some bamboo scrolls, silk or fermented fish sauce. But don't get cocky, because in ancient China, merchants were considered just slightly more respectable than pickpockets and people who talk during movies. The scholars and nobles see you and immediately need to rinse their eyeballs, even though they secretly need your stuff. Hypocrisy in my ancient civilization. Groundbreaking. Breakfast. Slightly better rice. Maybe even dumplings if you're rolling in it. Still, you'll probably spend the morning calculating how much profit you can make before the next local official decides to tax you at sword point. If you're a scholar, alright nerd, you wake up in a slightly nicer house, because literacy is your superpower. And by superpower, I mean you can read, write, and memorize complicated Confucian rules about how to bow correctly or how not to breathe wrong in front of a noble. Morning routine? You pray, you meditate, you recite your favourite passages about filial piety, because ancient China was 70% about respecting your parents and 30% about inventing weird punishments if you didn't. Then you polish your calligraphy brushes because looking good while writing about virtue is a full-time job. Breakfast? Rice. Always rice. Maybe a chicken egg if you're fancy. If you're really high up, maybe some pickled veggies that have been soaking since the last emperor's cousin got exiled for blinking wrong at a banquet. Then you spend the day teaching, copying texts, or, if you're lucky, climbing the bureaucratic ladder, which is a lot like climbing a ladder covered in oil while people throw rocks at you. So, you know, fun. If you're a noble. First off, you're not even waking up yourself. Some poor servant is awkwardly clearing their throat by your bedside like, sir? Time to exist. Your bed. It's actually made of wood, but it's lacquered and has dragon carvings, so it feels impressive. You throw on some silk robes embroidered with symbols of cosmic authority that basically scream, "Bow down to me, peasants, for I have not touched mud in 3 generations." Breakfast? A literal feast. Rice, meats, fruits, imported from God knows where, and teas brewed with water that was probably filtered better than modern city tap. You casually munch while thinking about how you're technically supposed to be virtuous and humble while wearing 20 pounds of jewellery. Then it's either deal with imperial court politics, aka trying not to get assassinated before lunch, oversee massive projects like canal digging where thousands might die, or host poetry contests where losing could mean a loss of face worse than actual death. Good times. All right, you've survived the waking up part. Congrats. Now it's time for breakfast, lunch and dinner, also known as the 3 daily reminders that you're one bad harvest away from eating your belt. Eating in ancient China was basically a game of how much rice can you eat before you remember you can't afford anything else. If you were lucky, you got porridge. Rice porridge if you were in the south, millet porridge if you were up north. Either way, it tasted like sadness and bland hopes for a better afterlife. Some days, if your ancestors were smiling on you and the rats didn't eat everything during the night, you might get a boiled vegetable or two, maybe some cabbage, maybe some wild garlic if you were feeling spicy, maybe a fish so small it blinked twice before dying of embarrassment on your plate. And listen, you think you know tough cuts of meat. They were eating organ stew out here. Intestines, liver, mystery lumps with the veins still attached. You didn't ask what it was. You just chewed aggressively and thanked the gods you had anything at all. Meanwhile, if you were rich, and by rich I mean has shoes that match, your meal started looking a little better. Rice still, yes, because it's China and that's the law, but with side dishes, pickled cucumbers, dried tofu skins, duck eggs that had been salted until they tasted like a savoury punch to the face. And if you were really rolling in that ancient cash, meat, pork belly that dripped grease like a dream, roasted duck with the crisp skin crackling just right, and soups, endless, bubbling cauldrons of herbal soup that could cure anything except the crushing weight of dynastic politics. Oh, and then there were the weirder moments. You think modern food trends are weird? These people were already on their flexitarian, paleo-organic, local-source journey before it was cool. Alchemists were out there grinding jade into powder and mixing it into tea like, this tastes like extremely expensive stomach cancer. Some genius decided mercury was good for you. Yeah, mercury. The same stuff that nowadays you wouldn't touch without gloves and therapy. Fun fact, if your local physician told you to drink a potion made of ground deer antler, bear bile, and something vaguely described as mystical mountain essence, you just did it. Because arguing with the town doctor was a great way to wake up with no kidneys. And of course, there was tea. Tea was the one pure thing. Rich, poor, scholar, merchant, random guy selling snakeskin belts on the corner. Everybody drank tea. Sometimes it was literally just boiled water with a leaf floating in it. But still, tea. The real MVP. So, yeah. Food in ancient China was either enough to keep you moving, or enough to make you write a 30-stanza poem about how full you feel. There was no in-between, and let's be honest, if you lived back then, you'd either be gnawing on a root and pretending it was cake, or laying back in silk robes, eating plums imported from somewhere so far away that someone probably died bringing them to you. Either way, you'd still die young, bloated with pride, or just bloated. Okay, you've dragged yourself out of bed. You've eaten your soggy bowl of congratulations, it's porridge. Now what? Welcome to the Daily Grind Ancient China edition, and let me be very clear, nobody was having fun. If you were lucky, and by lucky, I mean your family hadn't been crushed by tax collectors yet. You spent your day farming, and farming in ancient China wasn't just plant seed, water plant, look inspirational under the sunrise. Number it was back-breaking, mud-slogging, worm-punching, sun-blinding labour, from the second your bowl hit the floor to the second your face hit the bed again at night. You woke up before the rooster. You planted rice seedlings knee-deep in swampy water that smelled like every bad decision made in a 10-mile radius. You fought off mosquitoes the size of small birds. You bent over so much that your spine just gave up one day and turned into a question mark, and heaven help you if a drought came, or a flood, or locusts, or a noble riding by on a horse so shiny it reflected your poverty back at you like a mirror, demanding more taxes. You didn't own the land you farmed, you borrowed it from somebody richer, who borrowed it from somebody even richer, who prayed nightly that you stayed alive just long enough to finish paying off your great-great-grandfather's debt. Now, say you weren't a farmer, maybe you were a merchant, maybe you thought, hey, selling stuff sounds easier than fighting riverworms with my bare hands. It was easier. If by easier you mean walking 100 miles through bandit-infested mountains with a backpack full of overpriced silk scarves, hoping not to get stabbed for your troubles. You had no trucks, no Uber Eats, no shipping labels. You had your sandals, your brittle knees, and your irrational optimism. Markets were chaos. Sellers screaming prices, customers screaming for discounts, chickens screaming because someone dropped them. Half the day was bargaining over a single copper coin. The other half was trying not to get pickpocketed by a 12-year-old with faster hands than fate itself. And if you were successful, if you actually made money, congratulations. Now you were a target for corrupt officials who could invent a tax out of thin air. Oh, you're selling rugs? New law? Rug tax? Hand it over. Meanwhile, scholars were living a completely different nightmare. People imagined being a scholar was glamorous, sipping tea under peach trees, writing poems about the clouds. Wrong. You were cramming for exams harder than a modern student jacked up on caffeine and existential dread. The imperial exams, the ones that decided if you got a cushy government job or spent the rest of your life teaching reluctant 8-year-olds, were brutal. They tested your memory, your handwriting, your poetry skills, your knowledge of Confucian classics, and probably how well you could cry without smudging the ink. Fail once, study harder, fail twice, hope your parents still love you. Fail 3 times. Congratulations, you're now a tutor making less than a rice farmer, and if, by some miracle, you passed, you'd get a job sitting behind a low desk in a dim room, transcribing tax records, reading memorials to the emperor that nobody cared about, and praying your superior didn't frame you for embezzlement just to earn promotion points. Now, the nobles, the top dogs, you'd think they had it easy, sort of, but also, not really. Yes, they had silk robes. Yes, they had feasts with duck and wine and whatever weird animal the hunters dragged home that week. But they were stuck playing the world's most stressful game of Survivor, Palace Edition. One wrong word at a banquet and boom, you're out. Out meaning off with your head, not voted off the island. Palace intrigue was a full contact sport. You had to look good, sound good, flatter the right people, sabotage the wrong people, and never, never let anyone see you sweat. And if you were a noble woman, oh sister, your whole existence was a terrifying ballet of marrying the right man, bearing the right sons, wearing the right hairpins, and not looking even slightly more beautiful than the Empress, unless you wanted to mysteriously fall ill one night. In short, work was everywhere, inescapable and merciless. You either spent your days bent double under the sun, hunched over scrolls until your back screamed for mercy, pacing marketplaces haggling for your life, or smiling sweetly at people who would absolutely poison your soup if they thought it would boost their career. There was no following your passion. There was no taking a mental health day. There was only doing what needed to be done day after day until your body gave out or the emperor changed his mind about how much taxes you owed. And guess what? Even if you did everything right, even if you slaved and toiled and flattered and bribed and prayed, sometimes the harvest failed. Sometimes the river flooded. Sometimes the emperor had a bad dream about dragons and decided to raise taxes just to feel better about himself. Sometimes life just sucker punched you for fun. And when it did, you didn't cry. You didn't protest. You just picked up your tools, or your scrolls, or your overpriced silks, and you started over. Because that grinding, stubborn, never-quit survival was what life was really made of. All right, you've survived another day without being eaten by river leeches, extorted by a corrupt official, or poisoned by your political rivals. Congratulations, time to have some fun, right? Well, ancient China's idea of fun was a little different from ours. Spoiler alert, it was about 40% less fun and about 60% more try not to die creatively. First up, music and dance. If you had the energy, and most people didn't, you might pick up a lute, bang a drum, or attempt to play a flute that sounded suspiciously like a duck being strangled. If you were rich, you hired performers. If you were poor, you were the performers. Dances back then weren't TikTok-ready moves either. We're talking ceremonial dances, long, slow, hypnotic movements that either summoned blessings from the gods, or, if you were particularly unlucky, summoned the mockery of every drunk uncle at the village festival. Now, if you were more of a sit and vibe type, storytelling was the ancient Netflix. You'd gather around the oldest, weirdest man in town, usually missing several teeth and most of his filter, and listen to tales of dragons, fox spirits, ancient battles, tragic lovers, and gods who couldn't seem to keep their human disguises on for 5 minutes without causing a scandal. And let me tell you, the plot twists? They made Game of Thrones look like a polite tea party. Want to hear about a fisherman who accidentally marries a river goddess? Got you covered. Want to hear about a ghost who falls in love with a scholar and ruins his GPA forever? Pull up a stool. Gambling was also huge. Cards, dice, betting on cricket fights. Yes, crickets. Tiny bugs throwing paws like they owed each other money. It was serious business. Men would crowd around 2 furious insects in a pot, betting hard-earned coins, shouting strategies like "bite his antenna" or "go for the knees," as if the crickets could hear them and cared. Nothing like risking your week's wages on an angry grasshopper to really spice up your existential dread. Then there was drinking. Oh, the drinking. Rice wine wasn't just a beverage, it was therapy. Bad harvest? Drink. Lost a tax dispute? Drink. Found out your neighbour's goat trampled your whole cabbage field? Double drink. Banquets could get wild, and by wild, I mean uncontrollable sobbing and aggressive poetry battles. That's right, you didn't freestyle rap in ancient China, you freestyle poemed. Picture 2 slightly tipsy scholars standing up at a feast, dramatically spouting verses about the fleeting nature of life, the sorrow of autumn leaves, or how beautiful the moon looked when you were too drunk to see straight. Crowd goes wild. Applause. Maybe a sympathetic tear or two. No one went viral, except maybe from food poisoning. Now, if you were feeling brave or reckless, you could try your hand at martial arts, not just the fancy movie stuff. Basic self-defense was part of everyday life, because bandit attack was less of a rare tragedy and more of a Thursday afternoon. Some villages even had little martial arts clubs where you could learn how to not die when someone swung a rusty sword at your head. Good times, and for the ultra-elite, the nobles and imperial families, their fun was watching acrobat shows, animal performances and mock battles. Basically early prototypes of Cirque du Soleil, but with a 40% chance someone actually broke their neck mid-performance. No pressure. They also played strategy games like Lubo. Imagine a board game so complicated, even the historians today can't agree on how it worked. You sat around rolling dice, moving pieces, and pretending you knew what was going on while secretly praying nobody noticed you were just making it up as you went along. Honestly, some things never change, and if none of that sounded good, if you didn't feel like gambling or drinking or fighting or pretending to understand ancient board games, you could always go to a temple fair. Temple fairs were chaotic marketplaces where you could buy trinkets, snacks, charms against evil spirits, and sometimes shady miracle cures like, "This powder will make your neighbour's rooster stop crowing at 4 a.m. They had puppet shows, puppet fights, puppet romances, basically puppet soap operas for when real human drama wasn't messy enough. And through all of this, fun in ancient China was never just about pleasure. It was about survival. It was about community. It was about reminding yourself you were still alive, even if tomorrow might involve a famine, a plague, or an angry taxman. Every game played, every story told, every cup raised was a tiny rebellion against the crushing weight of existence. You didn't have much, you didn't have power, but for a few stolen moments under the ancient stars, you had laughter, and that was enough. All right, you've eaten your sad breakfast, hustled your lungs out trying to not get robbed at the market, crushed a few crickets for entertainment. Now let's talk about something truly uplifting. Your inevitable, painful death, and the charming lack of modern hygiene that got you there. Welcome to healthcare in ancient China, where the motto was basically, if it doesn't kill you immediately, it probably builds character. First things first, bathing. You'd think with all the rivers, lakes and pretty poetry about lotus ponds, people would be scrubbing up daily like some ancient TikTok influencer. Yeah, no. Bathing was more of a special occasion thing, like weddings, religious ceremonies, or when your odour developed sentience and started negotiating trade deals with neighbouring villages. Soap? Ha! You had ashes, rice water and fermented bean juice. Good luck exfoliating that blacksmith's elbow grime with last week's noodle rinse. Rich folks, of course, had fancier options. Perfumed oils, hot water baths, even attendants to scrub you down while judging your life choices in silence. If you were poor, you were lucky to dunk your head in a muddy ditch once a month and hope no leeches decided to move in. Now, diseases. Oh, the diseases. Ancient China was a swirling hot pot of delightful plagues just waiting to turn your organs into soup. Smallpox? Check. Tuberculosis? Check. Dysentery? Triple check with a side of violent regret. You could basically die from breathing wrong, drinking wrong, or standing too close to someone who coughed wrong. Doctors? They existed. Sort of. Traditional Chinese medicine was a fascinating mix of legitimate herbal wisdom, terrifying guesswork, and bold, fake it till you make it energy. One doctor might treat your fever with ginseng and acupuncture. Another might prescribe drinking mercury because shiny things must fix dull souls. Spoiler, mercury doesn't fix you. It just kills you very slowly and dramatically, which, to be fair, might have been better for your legacy. He died glowing like a god, bro. Total legend. And don't even get me started on bloodletting. If you were sick, many believed it was because you had too much bad blood. Solution? Poke some holes in you and let it leak out. Makes sense, right? Lose enough blood and you'll definitely stop complaining. If you survived, congratulations. You are now cured. Or too dizzy to argue. Dentistry? Forget it. If you had a toothache, your options were, hope it goes away. Pull it out with pliers heated in a fire until it looked like a medieval torture device. Pray to your ancestors while drinking enough rice wine to forget you ever had teeth. And speaking of praying, superstitions ruled health practices. If you sneezed too much, someone might accuse you of angering a mountain spirit. If you had a headache, it wasn't dehydration. It was probably a ghost clinging to your scalp because you forgot to burn enough incense last Tuesday. Doctors, shamans, priests, and grandma's neighbour's cousin all had opinions on what you should do, usually involving odd diets, terrifying pills made of powdered tiger bones, or sticking herbs up places herbs should not go. Now, if somehow you avoided disease and bad doctors, there were still about 1,000 creative ways to die young. Farming accident, the ox kicked you into the afterlife. Construction accident, you fell off a wall, the wall, as in Great Wall, getting drafted into a war you didn't sign up for, executed for saying something slightly spicy about the Emperor's new robe collection, eaten by a tiger, eaten by a slightly faster, angrier tiger, food poisoning from yesterday's seafood that was definitely yesterday's seafood life expectancy. If you made it past 35, you were basically Gandalf, an ancient wizard among mortals. Kids would stare at you in awe like, "Whoa, he has all his teeth and everything." And here's the thing, you weren't even mad about it. Death was so casual, so baked into the background radiation of life, that you just accepted it. You lived hard, loved fast, gambled on cricket fights, wrote bad poems about the moon, and occasionally bathed. Because if there's one universal truth about ancient China, and probably about every civilization ever, when life is short and brutal, you celebrate every stolen day like the small miracle it is. Even if your breath smelled like fermented tofu. Even if your biggest medical advancement was don't die. Even if your idea of personal hygiene was aggressively fanning yourself and hoping for the best, you lived, and that was enough. So you've survived another glorious morning of not dying from ghost-induced headaches or ox-related accidents. Good job, champ, but don't celebrate yet. Because in ancient China, it wasn't just disease or hungry tigers you had to worry about. It was social rules. Unwritten laws so strict and bizarre that one wrong sneeze, smirk or mispronounced word could absolutely nuke your entire life. Let's start with dress codes. You didn't just roll out of bed, slap on whatever smelled the least like wet goat, and call it fashion. Oh no. What you wore could literally determine whether people bowed to you or beat you with sticks. Colours mattered. Certain shades were reserved only for the emperor and his royal entourage. Yellow, for example, was basically copyrighted by the emperor. Wear a bright yellow robe without permission, and people would assume either you had a death wish, you were starting a rebellion, or you were too dumb to live anyway. Silk robes, elaborate hats, embroidered shoes, all of it screamed your rank, your job, and how many people you could order around before breakfast. If you dressed above your station, big trouble. Off with his social status, or sometimes literally off with his head. Now, bowing etiquette. Bowing wasn't just a polite nod like, "Yo, what's up, neighbour?" It was an art form. There were about 100 different ways to bow depending on who you were talking to, how powerful they were, what season it was, how much you valued your spine. Alright, so you've somehow survived disease, bad bowing, and the 500 unwritten rules about pants colour. Congrats, legend. You're doing better than 90% of ancient China already, but buckle up, because we're about to dive into the strange beliefs and gloriously weird inventions that made ancient China both the envy of the world and occasionally the laughingstock of the universe. First up, alchemy. If you thought alchemy was just some Harry Potter nonsense, think again. Ancient Chinese alchemists were out here dead serious about mixing random powders, minerals and dragon parts to create magic potions. Their number one goal? Immortality. They genuinely believed you could drink your way to eternal life if you just found the right combination of mercury, sulfur, crushed pearls, and possibly the tears of disappointed family members. Spoiler alert, you didn't get immortality. You got immediate catastrophic organ failure. The irony was absolutely peak. The emperor would pay a wizard in a funny hat a truckload of gold for a sip of live forever juice, only to drop dead 2 weeks later with a mouthful of cinnabar and regret. Next, medicine. Ancient Chinese medicine was a mix of brilliant herbal science and what if we just stabbed you with needles until you felt better? Acupuncture was invented during this time. and while it's still around today and actually works for some stuff, back then it was kinda more like a human dartboard situation. Ah, you have chest pain. No problem. We'll just stick 47 needles in your feet and call it a Tuesday. Oh, and if that didn't work... They also prescribed fun remedies like drinking powdered rhinoceros horn, bathing in special blessed mud, or swallowing small bits of jade to purify your intestines. Which, spoiler, it didn't. Diseases? They were everywhere. Cholera, smallpox, tuberculosis, the ancient Chinese greatest hits. You could catch something fatal by breathing the wrong air, touching the wrong neighbour, or even just standing near a river that had slightly too many dead things floating in it. Also, doctors would often diagnose you by taking your pulse and squinting really hard while muttering about bad wind energy in your spleen. Medical accuracy, 7% vibes-based diagnosis, 100%. And don't even get me started on fun ways you could die. Besides the classics like famine, warfare, and oops, a tiger, you could also meet your untimely end by eating the wrong mushroom, being crushed by a collapsing rice granary, falling off the Great Wall during construction. Seriously, OSHA wasn't a thing. Getting sentenced to death for sneezing during a sacred ceremony, accidentally insulting your neighbour's ancestral spirit because you borrowed their rake without permission, and the average life expectancy, about 35 years old. If you made it past 40, you were basically a walking legend. People would point at you like, look, it's old Master Wang, who survived 9 plagues, 14 bad rice harvests, and 1 very cranky horse. So yes, life in ancient China was innovative, spiritual, poetic, and absolutely terrifying if you were a normal breakable human made of meat and bad luck. Long story short, you weren't just fighting tigers and famine, you were fighting mercury smoothies, death by acupuncture, and the invisible spirits of mild social embarrassment. Good times, glorious times. The Great Wall of China has often been compared to a dragon, with its head in the east and tail to the west, winding over thousands of miles of hills and mountains. In fact, one legend tells us that it was a dragon who determined the course the wall would take. In China, the dragon is an auspicious, protective creature, representing the life-giving force of water and which embodies wisdom, strength, and goodness. So, too, does the Great Wall. It represents the Chinese Empire protecting itself against attack by the nomads of the north, while remaining strong and good within. It symbolizes the orderliness of China, first brought to the land by the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi. Water had been a lucky element of the Qin, and the emperor chose this as his symbol. Thereafter, the dragon was symbolic of the emperor. The Great Wall was added to, repaired, rerouted, and reconstructed over many dynasties, particularly during the Ming dynasty of 1368 to 1644 AD. This essay will concentrate on the work done during the Qin dynasty only, because it reflects the establishment of the imperial system by the first emperor. The idea of wall building started quite early in China. In 400 to 300 BC, the various states in China had been separate, warring factions, each trying to gain control over the others. It was common practice for these states to build walls to protect themselves from other states. One of the early walls built in China dates to about 450 BC, by the Kingdom of Qi in northeast China, preventing its neighbouring state Lu from attacking Qi. Other walls were not built for another 100 years. The idea of building walls for protection seemed to catch on, and soon the kingdoms in the north of China were building walls to keep out the northern nomads. The nomads were the Xiongnu, or Huns. They made their living by raising animals, contrary to the agricultural lifestyle of the Chinese. The Huns were a slave society and made regular raids on neighbouring Chinese states, taking the people for slaves and causing other damage. By the year 221 BC, the state of Qin had conquered the neighbouring states and formed the first united empire in China. The ruler of the Qin state called himself the first emperor and modelled himself after the legendary Yellow Emperor Huangdi, who was known for bringing order into the world and having the secret of immortality. The emperor's full title was Qin Shi Huangdi, first emperor of Qin. There were some minor problems with unifying such a large collection of territories. Each state had its own system of weights, measures, money and writing. This caused considerable problems when the empire was supposed to function as one nation, so Qin unified these systems so that all regions of the empire would use the same standards. The protection of this newly founded empire was of paramount importance. The raids of the nomads from the north were causing economic damage to the developing economy. The emperor Qin Shi Huangdi took on the task of having the many walls already built connected together to form a single strong wall of defence. This we know as the First Great Wall of China. The first crew sent to the northern regions by Emperor Qin to build the Great Wall was soldiers. General Meng Tian was given 300,000 soldiers and sent to begin the construction. Military garrisons were assigned particular tasks, and in other cases large forces were concentrated to tackle certain sections. Another way people were sent to work on the wall was through a kind of corvée system, where each citizen owed the emperor 1 year of his life for building or defending the wall. Approximately 500,000 peasants spent their time in this way. However, the regime could always find excuses to add more time to one's service. Emperor Qin was notably a harsh ruler. He believed that the only way to establish peace within the empire was through strict rule and adherence to the demands of the emperor. The criminal justice system dictated harsh punishments for criminals. Under the law of Qin, many crimes were punishable by a period of time serving hard labour working on the wall. The law said that a person had to be at least 1.38 metres tall to be given a servitude penalty, so shorter convicts were put in jail until they grew tall enough to be put to work on the wall. This leads to the question of child labour. Supposedly, no one under the age of 15 could be sent to work on the wall. However, there are records indicating that children as young as 7 and 8 were actually working. As is frequently the case in this kind of situation, money could buy one out of this time of serving on the wall construction. One could buy off a corvée, or even pay for a crime with money, or buy a servant to serve the required time on the wall. Therefore, it was the poor people who, in fact, worked and died along the Great Wall. The basic materials used in the construction of the wall in Qin times included earth, stone, timber, and tiles. Materials were always gathered locally, so various sections of the wall reflect what was available in the surrounding area. In the high mountains, stones were quarried from the land. In areas of flat, loess soil, a special kind of soil blown in from the Gobi Desert and carried by the Yellow River, the soil was used to create tamped earth layers. In the Gobi Desert area, alternating layers of sand, pebbles, tamarisk twigs, a small shrub, and reeds were used. In the northeast, near Liaodong, boards of oak, pine, and China fir trees were used. It is said that if all the stones used to build the Great Wall were used to build a wall 1 metre wide and 5 metres high, that wall could circle the globe at the equator 10 times around. There are 3 major areas of discussion about how the Great Wall was built: transportation, technique, and design. Transportation of materials was a great project in itself. The tightly structured regime of the first emperor guaranteed that hundreds of thousands of people were available to carry on the necessary tasks. People were the main source of transportation. They carried supplies on their backs or with carrying poles over their shoulders. They also passed materials hand to hand in a long line up steep slopes or along the top of a completed section. Simple tools were used when possible. These included handcarts, wooden rods, levers and windlasses. Ropes were slung over deep ravines and valleys to send baskets full of materials to the other side. It seems that not many animals were used for transportation during the Qin dynasty. but evidence of the use of goats and donkeys surfaces in the Han Dynasty, 206 BC to 220 AD records. The technique used in the actual construction of the wall in some areas is similar to that used in the building of mudhouse walls. There were 2 stone walls built, and the space between these walls was filled with earth and pebbles. The traditional technique of tamped earth with the loess soil was used in the areas where this soil was abundant. Posts or boards, sometimes bamboo poles, were used to create 2 walls with a space between. The loess soil was deposited in this space, then pounded by hand. Each layer of pounded or rammed earth was 7 to 10 centimetres thick and as hard as stone. The wall winds and twists over the land. This is because the builders took advantage of the natural landscape of steep mountainsides and difficult areas to traverse, putting natural barriers to their best use. The wall was designed so that soldiers could march along its top. Emperor Qin mandated that the wall be 6 horses wide at the top, 8 horses wide at the bottom, and 5 men high. At strategic points, like a pass between mountains, river bends and road junctions, were built forts, beacon towers, and other defence works. These became the components of an important communication system. Military forces could alert other areas of enemy sightings, send information on troop activities, and leaders could send orders. Beacon fires, flags, and drum beats were used on top of the beacon towers to send coded messages. These towers were built into the wall so they could be seen by the towers on each side. It follows that the thousands of people involved in this project would need to feed themselves. In some cases, whole villages were transferred to an area of the wall and would work to grow crops and make clothing and utensils to support the workers. In other places, the soldiers would plant crops and meet their own needs. The crops required water, so irrigation canals were dug. To meet the constantly moving construction site needs, roads were built. These developments actually aided the economic and cultural growth of the areas, and many of these settlements left behind artifacts of everyday life, as well as journals and information written on bamboo slips. Today the Great Wall stands as a memorial to the hundreds of thousands of workers who gave their lives in its construction. Emperor Qin wanted his dynasty to last 10,000 generations, and he himself was continuously seeking the elixir of immortality. Qin died, and his dynasty lasted less than 2 generations. However, his establishment of the imperial system lasted. The Great Wall stands as evidence that he organised a bureaucracy so well structured that its evidence remains more than 2,000 years later. Alright, you've just woken up in a Viking longhouse. Congratulations, you're still alive. That's a good start. But the smell is something else. Think of a mix of unwashed bodies, sweat, livestock, and the constant burning of wood in the hearth. It's like someone dropped an entire barn in your living room and said, "This is your home now." You sleep on a bed that's really just a pile of straw with some blankets thrown over it, and half of that straw is crawling with lice. Not exactly the luxurious Viking bedding you may have imagined. The worst part? You share this bed with your family, your livestock, and the occasional rat. So, privacy? Yeah, that's a myth. Now the good news is you're alive. The bad news? It's freezing cold. Your wooden hut might have a roof, but it's full of holes, and those gaps, they're for ventilation and letting the rain in. So you wake up, your back sore from the hard bed, your legs stiff, and if you try to stretch, it feels like your body is made of ancient oak. You roll out of bed, after not being able to rot a few more minutes in bed while scrolling through TikTok. You stagger to your feet and immediately step into something wet. It's not rain, it's not water, it's the mix of animal waste, old food, and whatever else might be in the mud floor. Don't look too closely. Seriously, don't. And, oh yeah, breakfast. What's for breakfast in Viking times? Well, no eggs, no crumble cookies, and definitely no Starbucks coffee. Your breakfast is whatever you can find, which means probably a bowl of soured porridge, Maybe some dried fish if you're lucky. Bread. If it's made from barley, it's more like a brick than something you can eat without risking a dental emergency. You wash it down with weak ale. That's right, even kids drink it. It's the only drink that won't immediately make you sick because guess what? The water is worse. So, cheers. You think maybe you'll enjoy a nice stroll after breakfast, but nope, it's time to work. And by work, I mean you're about to break your back doing hard labour for someone else's benefit. Whether you're farming, building ships, or forging iron, there's no break. You wake up at sunrise and you work until the sun sets. There's no such thing as getting off early. If you're lucky, you might get Sundays off, but not if there's raiding to do or if the crops need tending. And the weather? Oh, don't get me started on that. In the winter, your house is colder than the icy fjords outside. No insulation, no central heating. Just a fire you're constantly feeding with logs that cost more than your entire wardrobe. Summer isn't much better. You're roasting in your wool tunic while mosquitoes feast on your skin. The smell of sweat and smoke follows you around like a cursed cloud. But hey, it's not all bad. You could be out in the wilds with nothing but your axe, getting ready to raid a village, or maybe you're sitting in a smoky hall telling stories with the other warriors, drinking more weak ale and dreaming of the afterlife. If you're lucky, that might even be the highlight of your day. And just in case you thought hygiene was something the Vikings excelled at, think again. Bathing wasn't a daily thing. You'd get washed, if at all, by dipping yourself in a freezing cold river or using a bucket of water you had to fetch yourself. That's right, you've got no shower, no hot water, and definitely no soap. Don't even think about deodorant. If you were lucky, you might find some herbs to rub on yourself, but most days, you're just hoping you don't smell like death when you sit next to your comrades. But hey, at least you're a Viking, right? A little hard work, a little grime, but plenty of opportunities to prove yourself on the battlefield. It's not a glamorous life, but it's a damn tough one. And that toughness, that's what made them legendary. So grab your mead, sharpen your axe, and get ready for your life as a Viking. As a Viking, you weren't exactly the type to sit around sipping mead in cosy warm cabins. These guys were like the world's first real-life extreme adventurers. They didn't have Instagram to post their conquests, but if they did, it'd be full of violent raids, messy battles, and probably a few too many selfies holding up heads on pikes. Now, if you're thinking of Vikings as some romanticised warriors who rode into battle like the cast of a cool Netflix series, think again. The reality is much darker and much more brutal. First off, you've got to survive the cold. I mean, we're talking about a place where the winters aren't just cold, they're bone-chilling cold. It's so cold, you'd think even your thoughts would freeze. You're living in a wooden shack with no central heating, your roof's made of grass and turf, and you're stuck with a bunch of guys who really, really like to fight. Viking life isn't for the faint of heart. You don't get to be a Viking by being a peaceful farmer. You're a farmer with an axe, ready to raid the nearest village at the drop of a hat. Oh, and don't forget, you've got to deal with that Viking haircut, which wasn't so much about looking good as it was about practicality. Mostly, it was about making sure your enemies had something to grab onto when you're headbutting them in a brawl. But it's not just fighting that's your main hobby. Oh no, they've got a full agenda for fun. Besides raiding, pillaging and slaughtering, they also love themselves a good feast. We're talking giant, boar-filled, ale-saturated, horn-clinking, fire-blazing nights where you'd probably end up passed out before sunrise. So if you wanted to live your best Viking life, you better be able to handle alcohol and chaos in equal measure. You don't have a lot of time for anything other than survival. You don't get to live in a warm, cosy cabin, relaxing by the fire. You're out there in the elements, struggling to feed yourself and your family, knowing that any day now, your neighbours might decide it's a good day to raid your village. You can bet that when Viking men and women weren't out on those longships, They were busy sharpening weapons and trying to fortify their homes in preparation for the next inevitable attack. You live in constant fear of another tribe deciding your peaceful little patch of earth would make a perfect place for them to plant their flag and, more importantly, steal your stuff. And the Viking ships? Oh man, those things are no joke. If you've ever seen a Viking longship, you know it's built for one thing: destruction. These are war machines, not just boats. They can navigate rivers, coastlines, even frozen seas in the winter. You're not just cruising on a Sunday outing here, you're looking at an intense high-speed raid right into the heart of whatever poor village got unlucky that day. But here's a thing that a lot of people don't get about Viking society. You aren't just a bloodthirsty pirate. You had their own culture, your own beliefs, and a whole complex system of honour and respect. Sure, their idea of honour probably involved pillaging and plundering, but there was a code to it. For instance, if you were a Viking warrior, you were expected to fight for the glory of your god, which was mostly Odin, Thor and the gang, and in return, you hoped for a glorious death in battle. If you died in your bed of old age, that was seen as weak. The real goal was to die fighting. That's how you earned your place in Valhalla, the ultimate afterlife. So if you had to choose between living long enough to be old and miserable, or dying with your axe in your hand, the Viking way was simple: die with your boots on. And let's talk about the Viking ships for a second. Longships were the epitome of Viking technology. We're talking fast, lightweight, and capable of being paddled up shallow rivers or across the open ocean. These ships weren't just for travel, they were war machines designed for quick, brutal strikes. Imagine being a Viking and sailing into a village, raiding it, and then getting the heck out of there before anyone could even think of fighting back. No mess, no fuss, just pure, unfiltered chaos. But the Viking story isn't just about war and bloodshed, it's also about exploration. These guys were the real adventurers, long before Columbus set sail. Vikings travelled to parts of the world that most people didn't even know existed. They went all the way to North America, way before anyone else did. They discovered Greenland, Iceland, and maybe even parts of Canada. And all of this was done without GPS, smartphones, or even a decent map. They just hopped on their boats, crossed oceans, and basically said, well, let's see what's over there. And if it didn't work out, they just went home and tried somewhere else. Alright, so you've survived your Viking childhood without freezing to death, getting raided or falling off a longship. Congrats. But don't get too comfortable, because now comes the next charming chapter of your miserable little life. Disease, filth, and a complete lack of basic hygiene. See, personal cleanliness wasn't exactly at the top of the medieval to-do list, and by not at the top, I mean it wasn't even on the list. Bathing? Maybe once a week if you were really fancy, and even then you were probably scrubbing yourself down in the same filthy river you just threw your enemies into after a raid. Soap? Kind of. They had a primitive version made out of animal fat and ashes. Sounds refreshing, right? The average Viking probably smelled like a combination of wet dog, fermented fish, and regret. And you think your gym smells bad after leg day? Buddy, you have no idea. The stench was so bad that some Viking raids may have succeeded because villagers just didn't want to get anywhere near them. Seriously, who needs weapons when you can just weaponize your own BO? But wait, it gets worse. Let's talk about food. If you thought medieval cuisine was all about hearty feasts and roasted meats, think again. Sure, Vikings could throw down at a feast when they had the chance, but day to day, you're looking at a delightful menu of barley gruel, dried fish, questionable meats, and whatever roots you could dig out of the frozen dirt. Oh, and if you were lucky, maybe some sour milk. Yum. Malnutrition was so common that most people didn't even reach what we'd now consider average adult height. The typical Viking man, about 5 feet 7 inches if he was lucky, and built like a tree stump, not a gym bro. Strong, yes. Ripped? Only if you count ribs poking through your skin because half the time you were borderline starving. And just when you think life couldn't get any grimmer, boom, here comes the disease parade. Lice, fleas, and worms were basically your constant roommates. Forget about modern medicine. If you got sick, your best options were 1. Hope your body somehow fought it off. 2. Pray to Odin. Or 3. Die dramatically enough to at least earn some respect. Minor injuries could kill you. You cut your hand on an axe? Congrats. You're now on the fast track to a raging infection and a slow, painful death. Toothache? You better hope you enjoy excruciating pain, because there's no dentist here, just a guy named Bjorn with a pair of rusty pliers and some very questionable ideas about surgery. But despite all this misery, Vikings didn't just sit around whining. Oh no! These maniacs leaned into it. Pain, hardship, constant existential threat. They turned it into a lifestyle. If life was going to suck anyway, they figured you might as well suck harder than everyone else and make sure your name got remembered. Because in the end, that's what it was all about. Legacy. The Vikings believed that your reputation was your immortality. Carve your name into history, not by living a long life, but by living a loud one. Burn some villages, win some battles, die with a sword in your hand and a grin on your face. Entertainment. You love storytelling, sagas about gods, monsters and heroes. You also loved board games, like Nefertafel, basically Viking chess but bloodier, and sports that involve throwing heavy things at each other. You know, wholesome fun. But the real MVP of Viking daily life. Skalds. Poets who could recite epic tales or roast you into oblivion with deadly insults. A good skald was more dangerous than a sword, because while wounds heal, public humiliation lasts forever. And let's not forget, laws and government. You guys weren't wild anarchists. They had laws, councils called things, and even early versions of juries. Disputes were settled with debates, compensation payments, or, if all else failed, an axe fight. Efficiency. Now that you're good and filthy, half-starved and crawling with parasites, it's time to dive into the one thing Vikings were actually good at. War. Forget the Hollywood nonsense where Vikings show up in perfectly matching armour, swinging shiny swords in slow motion. Real Viking warfare was messy, chaotic and so brutally personal that it made modern war look like a polite disagreement at a coffee shop. First things first, weapons. If you were rich, and by rich, I mean you owned more than one tunic, you might have a sword. These were prized, passed down through generations, given names like Legbiter or Skull Splitter, because subtlety was not a Viking strong suit. But most Vikings? They fought with whatever they could afford. Axes, spears, knives, even sharpened farming tools. Congratulations, you're going into battle with what is basically a glorified hoe. And armour? Huh. If you weren't some nobleman with money to burn, your armour was a thick wool tunic, maybe some leather patches and a whole lot of misplaced optimism. Helmets were usually simple iron caps. You know those fancy horned helmets you see in movies? Complete garbage. No real Viking ever wore those, unless they wanted to get laughed off the battlefield and die looking like a drunken idiot. The battles themselves? Less organised, more screaming chaos. Imagine a stampede of angry, lice-infested men charging at each other with axes, screaming about glory and revenge, hacking and stabbing at anything that moved. There were no neat lines, no noble duels. It was pure carnage. If you slipped and fell in the mud, good luck. You were basically meat at that point. Tactics did exist, to be fair. Vikings often used the shield wall, locking their shields together in a wall of wood and muscle, pushing forward like a giant bloodthirsty bulldozer. It worked surprisingly well, until someone broke the wall, and then it was back to good old-fashioned throat-slitting and knee-breaking. And let's not forget the raids. Viking raids were a masterpiece of terror. They didn't just roll up to monasteries and politely ask for gold. They smashed down doors, torched buildings, slaughtered anyone who resisted, and dragged off anything valuable, including people. Monks, farmers, women, children, didn't matter. If you could be ransomed or sold, you were cargo now. The real secret weapon of Viking warfare wasn't just brute strength, it was fear. The mere rumour of a Viking longship on the horizon could send entire villages into blind panic. Kings would pay protection money just to avoid getting pillaged, basically the medieval version of a mafia shakedown. And it worked. Vikings got filthy rich, not just from stealing, but from being so terrifying that people paid them not to steal. But for all their bloodlust and brutality, there was a twisted kind of honour too. Dying in battle wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated. You wanted to die with an axe in your hand, guts spilling out, grinning through the blood, because that's how you punched your ticket to Valhalla. Viking heaven, where the ale never stopped flowing and the fights never ended. If you died peacefully at home, old, sick, bedridden, sorry, you were basically screwed. No glory, no feasts, no Valkyries coming to scoop you up. Just an embarrassing footnote in history, remembered as that guy who coughed himself to death while everyone else was out stabbing monks. In short, live violently, die gloriously, or be forgotten. After you've butchered half of England and scared every priest west of Rome into wetting himself, what's next? Exploration. You see, Vikings didn't just stick around Scandinavia sharpening their axes and inhaling fermented fish fumes. No, they got on boats, horrible creaking death traps with a sail, and hurled themselves into the unknown. Why? Maybe for glory, maybe for gold, maybe just because they were so deeply allergic to staying home sober for more than a week. Their ships were called longships, and they were absolute engineering marvels. If your engineering standard doesn't immediately sink, these boats were long, narrow and low to the water, which made them fast and sneaky. Perfect for sliding up rivers, sneaking behind enemy villages, and giving the local population a heart attack before breakfast. And where did they go? Everywhere. England, pillaged. Ireland, pillaged. France, pillaged so hard that the French king just gave them land and said, "Here, it's called Normandy now. Please stop setting fire to everything." But they didn't stop there. Vikings pushed north into Iceland, a frozen wasteland where the only thing more dangerous than the weather was the food. They settled Greenland, which was so hilariously misnamed, spoiler, it's mostly ice, that it sounds like a bad real estate scam even today. And then, around the year 1000 AD, a Viking named Leif Erikson stumbled across an entirely new continent. That's right. Vikings discovered North America about 500 years before Columbus ever got lost and lied about it. They called it Vinland, which means wineland, because apparently they found some wild grapes and immediately thought, hey, we can definitely get hammered here. But of course, it wasn't easy. The Vikings found out pretty quickly that the locals, the indigenous peoples of North America, weren't exactly thrilled to see a bunch of screaming, axe-waving maniacs show up. Skirmishes broke out, arrows flew, and after a few years of trying, and mostly failing, to not die horribly, the Vikings packed it up and sailed home. Still, for a brief glorious moment, a handful of ragged Norsemen stood on the shores of a new world, looked around and thought, hey, needs more beer, and the exploration didn't stop. Viking traders and adventurers pushed east too, sailing down the rivers of Russia, making deals and enemies with Slavic tribes, Byzantines and Arabs. Some of these Norsemen, known as the Varangians, even ended up as elite bodyguards for the Byzantine emperors. Imagine that. A bunch of giant bearded Northmen standing guard in golden palaces, still probably smelling faintly of fish and murder. What drove them? It wasn't just bloodlust. It was that eternal, gnawing Viking hunger for more. More land, more loot, more stories to brag about after death. Because in the Viking mind, you didn't just survive life. You fought it. You conquered it. And you sang about it, until the gods themselves were too drunk to ignore you. You might think Vikings were just angry farmers with a death wish, but there was method to their madness. It all came down to mythology, and not the Disney kind where everybody learns a lesson and sings a nice song at the end. Viking gods didn't promise peace, eternal happiness, or a cozy afterlife with harp music. Number. The Norse universe was brutal, chaotic, and doomed. The best you could hope for was to die screaming in battle, get noticed by Odin, and spend eternity fighting the same battle over and over in Valhalla until the end of time. If that sounds exhausting, congratulations! You're starting to think like a Viking. The Norse gods themselves weren't shining paragons of virtue. They were petty, vengeful, half-mad weirdos, basically humans, but with better hair and more lightning bolts. At the top you had Odin, the Allfather. Imagine Gandalf if he was a shady war criminal. Odin was obsessed with gaining more knowledge and power, and he didn't mind cheating, lying, or sacrificing an eyeball to get it. That's right. He literally plucked out his own eye and tossed it into a magic well just for a sip of wisdom. Hardcore. Then there was Thor, god of thunder, basically a giant red-bearded frat boy with a hammer the size of a cow. Thor smashed things first and asked questions never. People loved Thor because while Odin was out playing weird mind games, Thor was the guy who would punch a frost giant in the face just because it looked at him funny. And of course, there was Loki, the trickster. Half-brother to Thor, full-time agent of chaos, Loki was the guy who'd set your house on fire, help you rebuild it, and then steal it again, all while making it somehow your fault. Fun fact, Loki once tied his testicles to a goat as part of a weird bet. This tells you everything you need to know about Norse humour, but it wasn't just gods. The Viking universe was crawling with monsters, giants, witches, wolves the size of mountains, and serpents that could wrap around the world. And worst of all, it was all going to end in Ragnarok, a cosmic death battle where the world burns, the gods die, and everything is reset in a glorious catastrophic bloodbath. Imagine waking up every day, grabbing your axe and thinking, well, the world's on fire anyway, better make my death interesting. That was the Viking attitude, and that's why you're laughing in the face of death. That's why you're risking everything to sail across oceans, to charge into battle, to carve their names into stone and legend. Picture a Viking longhouse. It's not some tiny cabin. It's a giant smoky wooden hall big enough to fit a couple hundred people, plus dogs, livestock, suspicious barrels, and a few unconscious warriors already passed out in the corners. The roof is low, the fire pits blaze, and the smell is a mix of roasting meat, burning wood, wet fur, and feet. Absolute paradise if you were a Viking. Feasts weren't just casual get-togethers, they were massive events, usually to celebrate a successful raid, a good harvest, a big religious festival, or the fact that someone important didn't die that week. Everyone important showed up. The chieftain, warriors, traders, skalds, poets, farmers, and anyone else who could swing an invite, or at least a decent bribe. The food? Think entire roasted animals, pigs, goats, maybe a very confused swan if you were fancy, plus bread, cheese, stews thick enough to drown in, and a suspiciously large amount of onions. Vegetables were there too, but honestly they were mostly seen as things that take up space on a plate where meat could be. And fish. So much fish. Salted, dried, smoked. If it swam, it got eaten. Now, the drinking. Oh boy. Vikings didn't drink water if they could help it. Mead, fermented honey wine, was the drink of choice, but beer and ale were everywhere too. Drinking wasn't just for fun, it was mandatory. You toasted the gods, the ancestors, the chieftain, the guests, your neighbour's beard, and the fact you hadn't fallen over yet. Skipping a toast? Insult. Getting drunk enough to brawl with a chair? Totally acceptable. The toasts were called Bruggerful, and every toast had to be at least as ridiculous as the one before it. Example: I swear by Odin's good eye that I will sail further than any man here, or at least until I fall off the ship. Cue applause, laughter, and someone falling off their stool immediately afterward. Of course, feasts weren't just endless food fights, there was just entertainment. Skalds told epic sagas about gods, heroes, and that one guy who wrestled a walrus and lost. Musicians played bone flutes, lyres, and drums made from things you didn't want to ask about. Story battles broke out, where poets tried to out-insult each other in clever, devastating verses. If you couldn't keep up, you were shamed, or at least had your cup stolen. And yes, fights still happened. You pack a bunch of armed, half-drunk warriors into a smoky room and brag about who's tougher. Fists will fly. Axes might too if things got spicy. But most of the time it was all considered good fun, and the guy who got knocked into the fire pit was expected to laugh it off, after, putting out the flames. As the night wore on, things got messier. People passed out under tables, dogs licked up whatever was spilled, and somewhere in the back 2 guys were arm wrestling for the last hunk of goat meat, while a very serious argument about whose grandmother wrestled more bears broke out. And when dawn finally crept in and the fires died down, the survivors, hungover, sticky, half-naked, would stumble out into the cold morning mist, swear never to drink again, and promptly start planning the next feast. First, magic was absolutely real to the Vikings. They didn't sit around debating whether spells worked. They knew they did. If your cow dropped dead, or your fishing net ripped, or your wife suddenly hated you more than usual, someone had cursed you. No doubt about it. Probably that shady old woman down the road who talked to trees. The most powerful magic was called Seeder. This wasn't cute stage magic. This was serious sorcery involving trances, chanting, strange staffs, and a healthy dose of fear. Practicing Seeder meant you could see into the future, curse your enemies, control the weather, allegedly, mainly it just rained anyway, mess with someone's mind so they forgot how to hold a sword, or better yet, forgot they were supposed to stab you. Who practiced Seeder? Mostly women, called Völvas, or Zaidkonas, wandering priestess prophetesses wrapped in cloaks, carrying staffs and looking like they absolutely had everyone's fate written in a secret notebook. But the god Odin also practiced it, which was considered a little controversial, because in Viking society, magic was seen as extremely unmanly. Real men were supposed to smash things with axes, not chant in circles wearing mysterious necklaces. So Odin, being Odin, just didn't care what anyone thought, because when you're the All-Father, you make the rules. Runes were another way the Vikings tapped into the supernatural. Runes weren't just letters, they were some magical symbols that could protect you, curse someone, help you win a battle, make sure your crops grew bigger than your neighbours, the true Viking flex. You didn't just write runes, you carved them into weapons, jewellery, bones and stones, sometimes in secret places, just to freak someone out months later when they found it. There were runes for victory, love, luck, and even binding enemies. Basically magical post-it notes, but way cooler and way more dangerous. Then there were the Berserkers. Oh boy, these guys were the original terrifying semi-naked human hurricanes. Berserkers were elite Viking warriors who went into battle in a berserk gang, a blood-mad, trance-like rage where they howled like wolves or bears, felt no pain, didn't recognize friends from enemies, fought until they physically couldn't move anymore, or until everyone else was dead. How did they do it? Some say they drank potions made from mushrooms, alcohol, and pure bad decisions. Some say it was deep breathing techniques, chanting, or self-hypnosis. Some say they were just naturally built different and liked to headbutt trees for fun. Berserkers often wore animal skins, usually bear or wolf pelts, and believed they became those animal spirits during battle. If you saw a giant bearded man foaming at the mouth, shrieking like a banshee, charging at you with an axe bigger than your head, you didn't fight him, you just ran, fast. Now time to ask the big question, would you survive as a Viking? In theory, yes, if you like freezing, starving, bleeding and rowing for 12 hours straight. Vikings had some upsides. They could travel, fight for glory, and maybe earn a spot in Valhalla instead of just dying anonymously. But the downsides? Pretty brutal. Disease, violent deaths, awful winters, and no one cared about your feelings. Survival depended on being tough, lucky, and meaner than everyone else. And even then, you were probably one bad raid away from a spear in the gut. So, could you survive? Maybe. Would it be miserable? Absolutely. The history of the Vikings was significantly shaped by charismatic and powerful rulers who not only formed their own realms, but also had a lasting influence on the course of European history. In this section, we examine two of the most influential Viking kings, Harald Fairhair and Nut the Great. Harald Fairhair, also known as Harald I Hårfagre, is considered the first king to unite Norway into a single kingdom. His reign from around 872 to 930 AD marks a crucial turning point in Scandinavian history. He revolutionized Norway's political landscape and established a system of rule that formed the basis for the medieval Norwegian kingdom. Harald Fairhair's ascent began in his youth as the heir to a small kingdom in Vestfold. According to legend, he vowed not to cut his hair until he'd united all of Norway under his rule, hence his nickname Fairhair. His conquests began at the age of about 20 and lasted around 10 years. During this time, he systematically subdued the various small kingdoms and jarldoms of Norway. The decisive turning point was the Battle of Hafrsfjord around 872, in which he overcame the last resistance of the opposing petty kings. This battle is considered today as the birth of a united Norway. Harald Fairhair's most important political achievement was the creation of a centralized administrative structure. He introduced the system of jarls, loyal administrators who controlled various regions in his name. At the same time, he created a new tax system that strengthened royal power and formed the basis for a functioning state apparatus. He also established the Odel right, an inheritance law that regulated land ownership and continues to influence the Norwegian legal system to this day. His reforms in the areas of jurisdiction and administration laid the foundation for an orderly state system. Canute the Great, who ruled from 1016 to 1035, was one of the most powerful rulers of his time. He created a Nordic empire that encompassed England, Denmark and Norway, and at times also controlled parts of Sweden. His reign marked the height of Viking power in Europe and showed a remarkable fusion of Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon culture. Cnut's rise to power in England began with the invasion of his father Swene Forkbeard in 1013. After his father's death, Cnut took leadership and initially had to assert himself against Edmund Ironside. The decisive moment came in 1016 when, after several battles and Edmund's death, he was recognised as King of England. His rule over England was characterised by remarkable political wisdom. He retained large parts of the Anglo-Saxon administration and integrated the local aristocracy into his system of rule. Cnut pursued a policy of reconciliation, respected English traditions, and promoted cultural exchange between Scandinavians and Anglo-Saxons. He modernised the legal system and ensured efficient administration, which brought England a long period of peace and prosperity. Cnut's rule extended far beyond England. After the death of his brother Harold II, he also became King of Denmark in 1019. In 1028, he conquered Norway, thus creating a vast Nordic empire that dominated the North Sea. His imperial policy was characterized by skillful diplomacy and the ability to unite various cultural and political traditions. He promoted trade between the different parts of his empire and created an efficient administrative system that held the different regions together. Particularly noteworthy was his church policy. He actively supported the Christian church and promoted the construction of churches and monasteries, which contributed to the further Christianization of Scandinavia. His monetary reform unified the currency system in his empire and promoted economic exchange. Under his rule, both England and Scandinavia experienced a golden age of art and culture. Cnut the Great understood how to combine Viking traditions with Christian European elements, thus creating a multicultural empire that was far ahead of its time. Harald Hardrada, also known as Harald III of Norway, was one of the most fascinating Viking kings of the 11th century. Born around 1015, he led an exceptionally adventurous life that took him from Scandinavia to Byzantium and finally back to Norway. As the half-brother of Olaf the Holy, he had to flee into exile after Olaf's death in 1030, marking the beginning of his remarkable career. Harald's military career began in the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Emperor, where he quickly made a name for himself as a skilled tactician and fearless warrior. In Constantinople, he rose to become the commander of the Varangian Guard and led successful campaigns in the Mediterranean region. His campaigns stretched from Sicily to Jerusalem, during which he amassed considerable wealth. The Byzantine chronicles report on his tactical innovations and his ability to coordinate complex military maneuvers. Particularly noteworthy were his successes in naval warfare, where he combined traditional Viking tactics with Byzantine military strategy. After his return to Scandinavia, he used his military expertise to assert his claim to the Norwegian throne. In numerous battles against the Danish king Magnus the Good, he demonstrated his tactical skill until he was finally crowned King of Norway in 1046. As King of Norway, Harald Hardrada proved to be a capable, albeit strict ruler. His reign from 1046 to 1066 was characterized by significant administrative reforms and the consolidation of royal power. He introduced an efficient tax system and promoted trade, which elevated Norway to a significant power in the north. He paid particular attention to the development of Trondheim as an important trading centre. His rule ended tragically at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, when he fell in an attempt to conquer the English throne. His death symbolically marked the end of the Great Viking expansion. The Vikings left behind a rich legacy of historical personalities and legendary heroes whose stories are preserved in the Nordic sagas. Eric the Red, who discovered and settled Greenland, is one of the most famous Vikings. His voyages of discovery and the founding of the first European settlements in Greenland significantly shaped the expansion history of the Vikings. His son Leif Erikson went even further and became the first European to reach North America, where he founded the settlement of Vinland. Ragnar Lothbrok, whose life oscillates between history and legend, became famous for his bold raids and his dramatic end in a snake pit. The stories of Egil Skallagrimsson, the skald and warrior, combine poetic talent with typical Viking fighting prowess. The accounts of Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, one of the most widely travelled people of her time, show the significant role of women in Viking society. Bjorn Ironside, the son of Ragnar Lothbrok, became known for his successful campaigns in the Mediterranean region. These personalities embody the various aspects of Viking culture: spirit of discovery, warrior skills, poetic talent, and trading genius. Their stories were recorded in the sagas and continue to inspire to this day. They demonstrate the diversity of Viking achievements, from military conquests to voyages of discovery to cultural achievements. The legends surrounding these personalities often blend with historical facts, which makes them particularly appealing. They show the Vikings not only as warriors but also as explorers, traders, and statesmen who had a lasting impact on the history of Northern Europe. The Vikings' art of war was a highly developed and feared combination of tactical skill, superior weapon technology, and innovative shipbuilding. These aspects significantly contributed to their military success and expansion. Viking warriors, also known as berserkers, were more than just fierce fighters. They embodied a complex warrior system based on years of training and strict codes of conduct. Their skills were passed down from generation to generation and constantly refined. The training to become a Viking warrior began in early childhood. Young men first learned to handle light weapons and shields. The training covered various areas: physical fitness through strength exercises and endurance training, weapons knowledge and combat techniques, tactical training for various combat situations, mental training to strengthen combat morale. The training often lasted several years and was conducted by experienced warriors. Particular emphasis was placed on mastering different types of weapons. The Vikings developed sophisticated combat tactics that were far ahead of their time. The shield wall formation, a defensive tactic where warriors positioned themselves closely together with overlapping shields. Lightning-fast raids from the sea, psychological warfare through intimidating battle cries and wearing fear-inspiring armour, flexible combat formations that could quickly adapt to various battle situations. These tactics were perfected through intensive exercises and were key to their military success. The Vikings' arsenal of weapons was diverse and highly developed. Each weapon was forged with the utmost care and was often a masterpiece of the blacksmith's art. The most important Viking weapons were the longsword, a double-edged blade about 90 centimetres long, often with artistic decorations; the battle axe, ranging from light-throwing axes to heavy two-handed axes; the sax, a single-edged short sword for close combat; spears, suitable for both throwing and close combat. The Vikings' forging technique was particularly advanced. They used Damascus steel and other high-quality materials. The Vikings' protective equipment included round wooden shields with iron fittings, chainmail for wealthier warriors, helmets, mostly without horns, unlike popular depictions, leather armour for greater mobility. The protective equipment was individually tailored and offered a good compromise between mobility and protection. Viking ships were technological masterpieces of their time and enabled their far-reaching expeditions and military successes. Viking ships were characterized by several innovative features: clinker-built construction for better stability and speed, symmetrical hull for turning maneuvers without having to turn around, shallow draft for river travel and landings, combined sailing and rowing technique. The construction method was perfected over generations and enabled both deep-sea voyages and river expeditions. The Vikings developed advanced navigation techniques, use of sunstone for orientation, observation of bird flight and ocean currents, astronomical navigation, use of early forms of the sun compass. Their seamanship skills allowed them to navigate even under the most difficult conditions and cover long distances. The combination of superior weapon technology, sophisticated warfare and advanced shipbuilding made the Vikings a dominant power of their time. Their military innovations had a lasting influence on warfare in Europe, and many of their techniques were adopted by other cultures. Norse mythology formed the spiritual and cultural foundation of Viking society. This rich belief system not only shaped the daily lives of the Norsemen, but also significantly influenced their power structures and social values. The Norse pantheon included a multitude of deities who stood in a complex hierarchy to one another. This divine order was also reflected in the secular power structure of the Vikings. Odin, the All-Father, stood at the top of the pantheon. As the god of wisdom, war and poetry, he embodied many qualities that were also expected of Viking kings. Thor, the god of thunder, was particularly popular among warriors and common people. His strength and sense of justice made him the protector of humans. Freya, as the goddess of love, fertility and war, also held a significant position. Other important deities were Tyr, the god of law and honour, Heimdall, the guardian of the gods, and Loki, the cunning trickster. The stories of the Norse gods were passed down in the form of sagas and tales. The world tree Yggdrasil connected the 9 worlds. The creation story told of the world's origin from the primordial chaos Ginnungagap. Particularly significant were the prophecies about Ragnarok, the end of the world in which the gods would perish in a final battle. These stories conveyed important moral values and codes of conduct. The Vikings' religion was closely tied to their way of life and their understanding of honour and fate. The belief in fate, Weird, and the Norns, who determined the destiny of humans, was central. Religious rituals played an important role in Viking life. Blot sacrifices were performed at certain times of the year, during which animals, food, and sometimes even humans were sacrificed to the gods. The Yule festival in winter was one of the most important celebrations. Other significant ceremonies included naming ceremonies for newborns, initiation rites for young warriors, and burial rituals. In burials, it was believed that fallen warriors were taken to Valhalla, Odin's hall. The Vikings built temples and cult sites that served as a connection between the human and divine worlds. The most famous temple stood in Uppsala, Sweden. Sacred groves and sacrificial stones were also important cult sites. Thing sites, which served as assembly places, often had religious significance as well. The boundaries between political and religious places were fluid, as belief permeated all areas of life. The transmission of mythological traditions was mainly oral, through skalds, the professional poets and storytellers of the Vikings. The Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, which were only written down in the Middle Ages, are the most important sources for our current knowledge of Norse mythology. They contain poems about gods, hero songs, and mythological tales. The kennings, poetic circumlocutions in skaldic poetry, show the close connection between religion and art. Pictorial representations on runestones, jewellery and everyday objects complement the textual traditions. In Old Norse, the language the Vikings spoke, a Viking was a seaborne raider, and to go a Viking was to undertake seaborne raiding. Angus Somerville and Russell Andrew MacDonald, both professors at Brock University in Canada, wrote in their book The Vikings and Their Age, University of Toronto Press, 2013. The word is a job description, but it applied only to a small minority of the population, as many people in Scandinavia would not have taken part in raids. Among those who did raid, being a Viking was a part-time job since Viking expeditions were undertaken seasonally by small farmers, fishermen, merchants, chieftains, and aristocrats as a means of supplementing their income and winning fame, Somerville and MacDonald wrote. The word Viking was rarely mentioned in written sources during the time the Vikings were active. It was not until the 19th century that the term passed into common English usage, where it has generally come to be used as a descriptor for the peoples of Scandinavia in the period from the late 8th to the 11th centuries. Somerville and MacDonald wrote, "The Vikings intermarried or otherwise had children with the people they encountered. This meant that some Vikings were not of entirely Scandinavian ancestry." A study published in the journal Nature in 2020 found that there was a lot of genetic diversity in coastal areas of Scandinavia. Despite the popular belief that Vikings had blonde hair, the study found that many had brown hair. Modern-day historians use the term Viking Age to describe a period when the Vikings were expanding and launching raids. The years 793 to 1066 are frequently cited as defining the period, Somerville and MacDonald wrote, but these dates are subject to debate. In 793, the Vikings raided a monastery on Lindisfarne, an island off the east coast of Britain. They killed people and made off with a substantial amount of loot. The year 1066 was when William the Conqueror successfully invaded England. He led the Normans, a people who included Viking descendants. Although the Vikings originated in Scandinavia, they travelled to and lived across a vast area. The most distant western outpost known today is at L'Anse aux Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland in North America. While this outpost may have been in use for only a short time, there were Viking colonies on the western shore of Greenland that were used for centuries. The Vikings also travelled to the Middle East, reaching Constantinople and Baghdad by the 830s. John Haywood, an independent researcher, wrote in his book Northmen, the Viking Saga, AD 793 to 1241, Thomas Dunn Books, 2015. In Eastern Europe, Vikings conquered settlements and formed a state called Rus in the 9th century, Haywood noted. They would unsuccessfully lay siege to Constantinople in 860. The pantheon of Norse gods contains at least two tiers, the superior Aesir and the lesser Vanir. Sebjörg Valaker Nordeide, who was a medieval history professor at the University of Bergen in Norway, and Kevin Edwards, an emeritus professor of physical geography at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, wrote in their book The Vikings, Arc Humanities Press, 2019. The Vanir includes the deities Freya, Freyr and Njörður, while the Aesir includes Odin and his son Baldur. The two groups are constantly at war, which maintains an equilibrium, Nordeide and Edwards wrote, noting that there were also intermarriages and relationships between the groups, such as between Odin and Freya. In addition to these two pantheons, there were also mythological creatures, such as the Jötnar, who were in conflict with the gods. There was also a belief in Ragnarok, a world-ending event in which a being named Surtur would kill the gods and engulf the world in flames. In the 9th century there was a volcanic eruption in Iceland, and the inhabitants may have believed that Ragnarok was taking place. They built a boat-shaped structure out of rock in a cave and burned animal bones, possibly in an attempt to strengthen Freyr, a Viking fertility god who fought Surtur, archaeologists found. Contrary to popular belief, the Vikings did not wear horned helmets. Steve Ashby, a senior lecturer at the University of York in the UK, and Alison Leonard, an independent researcher, wrote in their book Vikings, Thames and Hudson, 2018. A complete helmet from Gjermundbu, Norway, has a number of composite iron sections. The Vikings had a writing system. During most of the Viking Age, writing in Scandinavia consisted mainly of simple, short inscriptions called runes on stone, bone or wood, Nordeide and Edwards wrote, noting that literacy among the Vikings was likely low. Elite members of Viking society were sometimes buried in boats. Boat graves would seem to have held special significance for the Scandinavian countries, Nordeide and Edwards wrote. You're born into 17th century England, into what people might call a decent family, not rich enough for fancy silk, Not poor enough to starve, just comfortably forgettable. Your mother does all the cooking, cleaning and, well, keeping you alive. Your father, he's never home for long, always out doing stuff. Then you hit the 1-year mark. Huge achievement, by the way. You've officially dodged the Grim Reaper newborn sweep, where nearly 40% of kids like you don't make it this far. Congrats. By age 3, you start realizing something's weird. Nobody visits your home, you don't live near other kids, and for some reason your mother never lets you wander outside. Something about wolves. Stray ones that apparently enjoy snacking on children. Then, one evening, your world cracks open just a little. Mum takes you to the market for vegetables, and instead of the grand adventure you imagined, you get stared at. Hard. People whisper, some glare, a few even curse at you and your mother. You're 3 years old, so obviously you have no idea what's happening. Maybe you dropped food on your shirt, maybe they just hate toddlers. Then you hear it. Executioner's brat. Your mother doesn't wait for more. She grabs you and hauls you home, moving faster than you've ever seen her. But it's too late. The word is out, and now so is your curiosity. That night, you wait. You sit, fidgeting, until Papa finally walks through the door, flamboyant coat looking like he just stepped off a stage. You don't even let him sit down. You need answers. And so, with a sigh, your father leans in and tells you why you live in the shadows, why people spit when they see your family. Your father is an executioner. And suddenly, the wolves don't seem so scary anymore. Your father is the man they call when they want someone dead, the walking embodiment of justice, or at least that's what the city tells itself. But there's a tiny little problem. He's getting old. And guess what? You're next in line. Wait, what? No. You had plans. Good plans. Maybe a blacksmith shaping steel instead of splitting skulls. Maybe a knight gutting enemies on the battlefield, not butchering criminals in the city square. Anything but this. Your father doesn't sugarcoat it. He sits you down, looks you straight in the eye, and hits you with the harsh truth. Nobody in the city will let you do anything else. Your father once dreamed of being a knight too, but that was never going to happen. His father was an executioner. His father before him was an executioner, and his father's father, guess what? Executioner. This is the family business. You're trapped. At age 12, training begins. Like any other job, you need to learn the trade. You start small, taking care of execution tools, sharpening axes, swords and ropes, cleaning up the execution sites after someone loses their head. It's gruesome, sure, but bearable, because at least you haven't had to watch someone die. Oh, look at that. You jinxed it. 8 months in, your father calls you to witness your first real execution. A man stands on the scaffold, weeping, begging for mercy. His children are in the crowd, screaming for their father's life. The crowd watches, some solemn, some hungry for blood. Your father stands there not like a man, but like a reaper waiting for the job to be done. And then, the rope. Snap. His neck. It hits you. This isn't just training. This is your life. Bitter, angry, trapped. You clean up the blood, haul the body away while the city glares at your father like he was the one who made the sentencing, like he's the villain. And one day, that'll be you. You're 14 now. 2 years of scrubbing bloodstains and hauling corpses have earned you the right to start real training. And by training, you mean something that makes those past 2 years feel like a vacation in Disneyland, if Disneyland had a chopping block and torture chambers. First lesson? Human anatomy. No, not sketches or dusty books. You learn by watching your father slice open real corpses right in front of you. At first, you turn away, gagging, but you don't get to look away for long. You learn, or you bleed. That's the rule. Every mistake is corrected with a beating. Executioners don't just kill, they extract information, which means you also learn the art of torture, and learning means watching. You watch him tear out a man's teeth one by one, while the victim screams and writhes in agony. You don't like it, But over time you learn something useful. Pulling out teeth with your bare hands, sloppy. A pair of pliers, much cleaner. A year passes. You master how to keep a man alive just long enough to make him confess. How the body works, where to cut deep, where to cut slow. You're almost ready to start killing. Except no. This job isn't just swinging a sword for money. There are rules. 2 more years. 2 years of memorizing laws, city regulations, execution protocols. Just you and your father, in a profession so cursed that nobody ever applies for the job. You don't have to compete. You don't have to prove yourself against anyone, because no one wants to live the life you were born into. Then finally your father decides it's time, but not for public executions. Not yet. First, you practice by torturing prisoners for confessions. It's slow, messy work, but you do it. And when your father sees that you can break a man without flinching, he nods. Now you're ready. Your first public execution. You pull on the black cloak, not to hide your identity, everyone knows who you are. It's to strike fear into their hearts. The crowd watches in silence as you step onto the scaffold, sword in hand. You keep your back straight, grip firm, unyielding. But inside, you're sweating, shaking, your heart hammering against your ribs. Your father's words echo in your head. Fake it till you make it. The convicted man is dragged onto the podium. He's forced to his knees. The priest murmurs a final blessing. You don't wait. Your sword flashes. One clean stroke, his head flies. The crowd gasps. The execution was so fast, so smooth, that for a second they can't believe it actually happened. You're good. Disturbingly good. The crowd disperses, but not without giving you a storm of curses. Even the priests spit at your feet like you chose this life, like you wanted to be a butcher in a cloak. Execution after execution, you improve. You refine your technique. Your father notices. Even he can't deny your talent. Soon, he retires. The title is yours now. The city's official executioner. Time to enjoy everything your father did. Being an executioner isn't just about swinging a blade and spilling blood. It comes with privileges. You're paid well, not just for killing, but for keeping the market streets sane. You're also allowed to take whatever you want from the dead. Clothes, jewellery, boots. Your wardrobe is built on corpses, and this makes people hate you even more. Imagine this. Elizabeth, whose father you beheaded yesterday, sees you parading through the market in his favourite coat. How do you think she feels? That's right. She wants to kill you, but she won't, because you're untouchable. The church refuses to let you in unless it's a special mass. That's rare. They say you're unclean, an unnecessary evil, and yet you're expected to marry. So you leave your father's home, buy a house on the city outskirts, and find someone as hated as you, a whore. She's beautiful. She understands you. She has no family, no one to judge her for choosing the city's butcher. Your wedding is as empty as your childhood dreams. No priests, no guests, just you, your parents, and one aunt, who probably came for the free meal. But at least you're happy. And for an executioner, happiness is a rarity. 1,000 deaths later, the years roll by. You become famous. Your name reaches neighbouring cities. 1,000 executions under your belt, and you are now a legend of death, feared more than any of your ancestors. But this isn't a statistic you take pride in. It haunts you every night. Their faces flood your dreams. Their screams crawl inside your ears and refuse to leave. The weight of their deaths crushes your chest. But life has one mercy left to give you. Your wife gives birth to a son and a daughter. For the first time you know true joy. You love them fiercely, protecting them, giving them a good life. That's all that matters now. But something is wrong. You feel it in your bones, your muscles. The stance that once made you a pillar of fear is now hard to hold. Your hands shake. It's only a matter of time before you make a mistake, and in this job, a mistake is death. The cycle continues. There's only one choice left. You hate it, but you know what must be done. You take your son aside and begin to train him, just as your father trained you. You carve the same fate into him as was carved into you. He hates it just like you did, but this is the only way. If he is to survive, he must be better than you. Because in this life, you don't live by mercy, you live by the blade. One afternoon in May 1573, a 19-year-old man named Franz Schmidt stood in the backyard of his father's house, in the German state of Bavaria, preparing to behead a stray dog with a sword. He'd recently graduated from decapitating inanimate pumpkins to practicing on live animals. If he passed this final stage, Schmidt would be considered ready to start his job as an executioner of people. We know the details of this morbid scene because Schmidt meticulously chronicled his life as an executioner, writing a series of diaries that painted a rich picture of this profession during the 16th century. His words provided a rare glimpse of the humanity behind the violence, revealing a man who took his work seriously and often felt empathy for his victims. But what's more, Schmidt wasn't necessarily all that unusual. Historical anecdotes reveal that the prevailing stereotype of the hooded, blood-spattered, brutish executioner falls far short of the truth. So then, what was it like to do this work hundreds of years ago in Europe? And how did executioner become a legitimate job title in the first place? What's common to all countries in Europe at the time is that they're all trying to have better criminal law enforcement, said Joel Harrington, a historian at Vanderbilt University in Tennessee, and the author of The Faithful Executioner, Life and Death, Honour and Shame in the Turbulent 16th Century. Picador, 2013, a book about Schmidt's life. The problem was that things were a little like the American Wild West, in that most criminals got away, Harrington told Live Science. So when they did catch them, they really liked to make a good example and have a public spectacle. Hence the need for public executioners to carry out that work. But people weren't exactly lining up for the job of hanging, beheading or burning criminals at the stake. Most people understandably saw this as undesirable work. In fact, those who ultimately became executioners didn't choose the job for themselves. Instead, it was bestowed upon them. In some cases, butchers were roped in to become executioners, or convicts were offered the job as an alternative to their own deaths. But typically, executioners came into the jobs through family ties. Most in the profession were men whose fathers had been executioners before them, Harrington explained. Even the diarist Schmidt was descended from an executioner. His father had unwillingly received the job when randomly ordained by a prince as a royal executioner. Over time, this passing of the baton from father to son created what Harrington called long-standing execution dynasties that spread across Europe during the Middle Ages. But the existence of those dynasties also reveals the poor image executioners had at the time. People were trapped in this family cycle of employment because in reality, they had few other opportunities to work, according to Harrington. People whose professions revolved around death were people that the rest of society did not want to associate with. So executioners were typically consigned to the fringes of society, and even forced to literally live at the edge of town. People wouldn't have invited executioners into their homes. Many executioners were not allowed to go into churches. Marriage has to be done at the executioner's home, Harrington said. Some schools would not even take the children of executioners. This social isolation meant that executioners were left to consort with others, forced to occupy society's underworld. Undesirables such as prostitutes, lepers, and criminals. That only boosted public suspicion of executioners and their families. Executioners, therefore, were a conundrum, crucial for maintaining law and order, yet shunned because of their unsavoury work. Attitudes toward professional executioners were highly ambiguous. They were considered both necessary and impure at the same time, said Hannele Klemetila MacHale, an adjunct professor of cultural history at the University of Turku in Finland, who has studied representations of executioners. Yet there were some professional perks to this morbid work. executioners benefited from something called havage, a kind of tax that gave them the right to take a portion of food and drink from market vendors for free, said Clemetilla McHale. What's more, the authorities usually gave the executioner free lodging and released him from tolls and taxes, she told Live Science. These small allowances were intended to compensate for executioners' social isolation and to compel them to stay in the job, but at odds with their lowly societal position was the professionalism that executioners were expected to show in their work. While the business of execution may seem like it would require little more than brute strength and barbarity, in reality, executioners needed a relatively high degree of expertise to do the job smoothly, said Clemetilla McHale. The office holder was expected to be successful at every execution. If he failed, he was accused not only of incompetence but also of cruelty, she said. In some regions, executioners were limited to 3 strokes for a beheading, and if a grisly scene resulted from one too many swings of the axe or sword, there could be serious consequences. Sometimes, an unsuccessful executioner was attacked by the furious spectators, and if he survived, the authorities punished him by withholding his fee or with imprisonment or dismissal, Clemetilla McHale explained. There was clearly a powerful incentive to execute as cleanly as possible, and that meant having a relatively good understanding of the human body. Contrary to popular opinion, executioners weren't uneducated. In fact, those in the profession had uncommonly high literacy rates for members of their social class, along with fundamental knowledge of human anatomy, Harrington said. This led to a surprising irony of the job. Some executioners could double up as doctors. This created an interesting societal paradox. People who didn't want anything to do with an executioner socially would come to his house and ask to be healed, Harrington said. We know, for instance, that Schmidt had many more patients he healed than people he executed, Harrington added. In fact, Schmidt wrote that doctoring would have been his chosen career had he not been forced into execution. Clearly, executioners from olden times were more than just blood-spattered brutes. Instead, the history books paint a picture of regular people forced into a job that nobody else would do, and in a time when execution was deemed essential for keeping the peace. Forget that image of the hood and them being anonymous and sadistic, Harrington said. They would have seen themselves as law enforcement officials. There's a final twist in the story of Schmidt. Over the course of his career, he had gained an unusual degree of respect due to his notable professionalism, which led to his appointment as the official executioner of the town of Bamberg, Bavaria. That earned Schmidt a generous salary and allowed him to live a very comfortable life with his family in a large home. However, he was still stigmatized because of his work, a fate he did not want to pass on to his children. So as a retired 70-year-old, Schmidt made it his mission to restore his family name. He appealed to Bavaria's authorities to release the Schmidt sons from their father's tormented legacy, and his bold bid was a success. His children were ultimately freed from a life at the executioner's block and given the right to pursue their own careers, as Schmidt had always wished to do. A happy ending to the executioner's tale. During the Middle Ages, common people lived incredibly harsh and physically demanding lives. They were serfs at the very bottom of the feudal system, and had to swear an oath on the Bible to serve and obey their local lord. Many peasants worked as farmers for the lords who owned the fields, and because of the nature of farming, certain tasks had to be done at very specific times of the year. Not only did they have to work their own small patches of land, but they were also obliged to work for free on church land. This was a huge inconvenience, time they could have spent providing food and money for their own families. The church held so much power that people were terrified of committing any sin that might offend God and cost them their place in heaven. On top of that, peasants had to pay a tithe, 1/10 of whatever they earned, to the church, either in money or goods. Since money was scarce, peasants usually paid in seeds, causing great hardship. They were left short of what they needed to sow the fields the following year. The church kept these tithes in massive barns. Sadly, much of the grain stored there would be ruined by rats, their urine, and their droppings. In 1395, the French historian and poet Jean Froissart described how much power the nobility had over the serfs. He wrote that serfs were bound by law to plough the fields of their masters, harvest the corn, gather it into barns and thrash the grain. They must mow and carry home the hay, cut and collect wood, and perform all manner of tasks of this kind. The forests were generally owned by nobles or even the king himself. Anyone caught poaching game faced severe punishment, while many peasants raised animals like chickens, sheep and cows to provide eggs, wool and dairy. The meat was a rare luxury. Eggs were so valuable that chickens were rarely killed for food. Animals like cattle and sheep couldn't survive through the winter without human help, so they would be slaughtered at the start of the cold season. Joints of meat were preserved by salting or smoking, hanging on hooks above the hearth to feed the family until spring. Peasants typically lived in wooden framed crook houses with barely any furniture. Straw lined the dirt floors. Cooking, sleeping and living all happened in a single room. At night, animals were brought inside to protect them from wild bears and wolves, still common in medieval England, and from thieves. Of course, bringing animals indoors made conditions even filthier. The livestock weren't house-trained and often carried fleas and mites. Beds were nothing more than straw-filled mattresses that attracted vermin. Peasants themselves were often infested with lice. There was no running water, no toilets. Human waste was collected in a bucket and either tossed into the street or dumped in nearby rivers or ponds, the same ones they used for washing and cooking. Lovely. The most commonly eaten meat among peasants was beef, ironically considered too vulgar for the nobility. A family might keep a cow until it was too old to milk, then slaughter it for meat. Nothing was wasted. The hide became leather. Bones were turned into needles, tools, or even weapons. Pigs were particularly valuable. They needed little care, could forage for food in forests and even cities, and could defend themselves against predators. When slaughtered, every part of the pig was used. Blood was made into black puddings, intestines became sausage casings, and even trotters were used for making jelly. Bacon and ham, once cured, became essential wintertime staples. In cities, few had their own kitchens. Ready-made food from street vendors was common, with beef or pork filling pies and stews. Sheep were also kept for milk, wool, and eventually mutton. After the Norman conquest of 1066, all game belonged to the nobles. Poaching deer or wild boar was punishable by death, though rabbits and hares could still be hunted by peasants. Nobles also kept domesticated rabbits in enclosures called warrens. In fact, Henry III of England once served 500 hares and 200 rabbits at a Christmas feast. In general, meat was a luxury for peasants, especially early in the Middle Ages. Most of their diet consisted of bread and cereals. By the 9th century, almost 3/4 of their food intake came from barley, oats and rye. Interestingly, after the Black Death devastated Europe in 1353, killing about 200 million people, food became much more available. Even the poor could afford more meat. Meanwhile, the rich ate exotic dishes. Recipes called for roasted cats, swans, peacocks, hedgehogs baked in pastry, and meats covered in sauces made of bread, wine and spices. One popular sauce, camelin, was sold ready-made in Paris during the 14th century. Swans were especially prized, often roasted, then redressed in their own feathers for presentation. Fishing was another source of food if the Lord allowed it. Thankfully, nobles preferred meat, so river and stream fishing was often permitted. Peasants living by the sea could fish freely. Salted and pickled fish like herring, mackerel and eel were common. Lampreys, hideous parasitic fish, were a delicacy. Henry I of England supposedly died from overeating them. Christianity heavily influenced eating habits. By the 10th century, fasting was required on Wednesdays, Fridays and Saturdays. No food could be eaten before 3 p.m, later moved to after evening prayers. During Lent, which lasted 40 to 46 days, meat, dairy and eggs were banned, making it a brutal time for hard-working peasants. On Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, no food was allowed at all. Regardless of wealth, bread was the foundation of every diet. Brown bread indicated poverty, since it was cheaper to produce than white bread. Wheat was for the finest loaves. Rye and barley were used for coarser breads. If crops failed, peasants supplemented with peas, beans, even acorns to make horse bread, edible, but barely. In larger towns there were more options, including white bread and fine flour rolls. Unleavened bread was used as plates, called trenchers, during feasts. Once soaked with gravy, trenchers were sometimes eaten or given to the poor. Ale, cider and mead were the main drinks, alongside water from clean rivers, wells or rain barrels. In towns where clean water was rare, small ale, low-alcohol beer, was drunk even by children. Ale was cheap, calorie-rich, and boosted morale in hard times. By the 13th century, adults drank about 1 gallon of ale a day. Vegetables, referred to generally as herbs, were a vital part of the diet. Common vegetables included carrots, parsnips, cabbages, and beans. Onions, leeks, and garlic were eaten by all classes, but nobles sneered at most other vegetables. Fresh vegetables and fruit were thought to cause disease if eaten raw. Cookbooks warned against salads and uncooked fruit. Thus, vegetables were stewed into soups, and fruits were baked into pies or preserved in honey. Apples, pears, quinces, cherries, strawberries, raspberries, and currants grew wild. Foraging was crucial. Peasants gathered berries, nuts, mushrooms, and wild honey. In mountain regions, chestnuts became dietary staples. Both rich and poor ate pottage, a simple stew made by simmering vegetables and herbs in water or ale. Meat could be added when available. The nobility enjoyed thicker, richer versions of pottage with expensive spices and ingredients known as a mortrue. This dish was thicker, richer, and often included expensive ingredients like saffron, almond milk, and a greater variety of meats. Pottage was a flexible dish. It could be kept simmering for days, with new ingredients added as they became available. For peasants, this meant a near constant bubbling cauldron of stew, where yesterday's leftovers blended with today's handful of vegetables, or the occasional lucky addition of meat. For those who could afford it, spices like pepper, cinnamon and cloves were highly sought after, and prized additions to food, imported from far-off lands like India and the Middle East. For the average peasant, however, flavouring food meant relying on garden herbs or salt, if they could even get their hands on enough of it. Salt, in fact, was so crucial that it wasn't just for seasoning, it was a vital preservative, used to cure meat and fish so it could last through harsh winters. Salt production was heavily controlled and taxed, meaning it was expensive and sometimes a luxury in itself for poorer families. In terms of sweets, sugar was virtually unknown to most peasants during the early medieval period. Honey was the primary sweetener, and it was highly valued not just for flavouring foods, but also for preserving fruits and even making mead. Beekeeping was a valuable skill, and honeycomb could often be traded for other goods or small luxuries. Cheese was another crucial part of the peasant diet. Milk from cows, goats or sheep was often turned into cheese because fresh milk spoiled quickly without refrigeration. Cheese could be stored longer and provided much-needed protein and fats, especially during periods of fasting when meat was not allowed. Daily meals were basic and practical. A medieval peasant's day might start with a breakfast of rough bread and ale, followed by a midday meal of pottage, and then a light supper. Again probably bread, perhaps some cheese, or cold leftovers from the midday meal. Variety was rare, and meal times were dictated by daylight hours and working schedules rather than by leisure or appetite. Life for the medieval peasant was not only hard but precarious. A poor harvest, a harsh winter, or an outbreak of disease could easily push an already struggling family into starvation. Famines were not uncommon, and malnutrition left people vulnerable to illnesses that today would be easily curable but were often fatal back then. Despite these hardships, the medieval peasant showed remarkable resilience and ingenuity. And here's something else that made medieval peasant life a little more unpredictable: foraging. When the garden or fields weren't enough, people went scavenging through the woods, hedges and meadows, picking whatever nature tossed their way. Berries, nuts, wild greens like nettles, even mushrooms if they were feeling lucky. Basically, if it didn't immediately kill you, it was dinner. Fish also played a surprisingly big role, not because peasants had fancy lakeside estates, but because the church was extremely fond of banning meat on dozens of fast days every year. When it wasn't allowed to chew on a nice hunk of salted pork, dried fish or freshwater eels were the next best thing. And yes, salted herring was considered a treat. Standards were different back then. Oh, and you might be wondering, why all the ale? It wasn't just because medieval people loved a buzz. It was because their water was often sketchy at best. Brewing ale, even the weak kind peasants drank, killed off most of the nasty stuff, so even toddlers were guzzling down low-alcohol beer with breakfast. Hydration, but make it medieval. Finally, medieval diets changed with the seasons. Summer meant fresh veggies and occasional fruit if you were lucky, while winter meals were a grim festival of dried beans, hard cheese, salted meat, and pottage that had seen better days. They weren't eating the same thing all year round. They were eating whatever hadn't rotted yet. But somehow, through a mix of foraging, brewing, salting, fasting, and just pure stubbornness, medieval peasants managed to survive and even carve out some good moments, usually involving communal feasts after a hard harvest, where for one evening nobody worried about tomorrow's dinner. Until tomorrow came, of course. And while their diets were limited compared to today's standards, they were largely natural, unprocessed, and seasonal, a kind of simple, earthy cuisine that, ironically, many modern people today might find themselves striving for under the label of organic or farm to table. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 125 AD. The good news, you're not a barbarian. The bad news, you still might die from a stubbed toe. Your bed. It's a sagging pile of straw dumped onto a wooden frame that creaks ominously every time you move. No mattress, no pillows, just a scratchy old blanket that smells faintly of goat and last week's sweat. Egyptian cotton? Please. You're lucky if the rats haven't chewed holes through your only tunic while you slept. You blink awake as the neighbour's rooster screams through your paper-thin walls. Or maybe it's the shouting from the streets, or a drunk legionary trying to find his sandals. Either way, you're up. Your home is a single cramped room, probably built out of wood, mud brick, or if you're fancy, stone. But don't get excited, it's basically a giant oven in the summer and a freezer in the winter. Privacy? Never heard of her. You share your house with your entire extended family, a couple of chickens, and whatever vermin decided to move in that week. The smell is something between wet dog, spilt wine, and humanity just giving up. There's no Febreze, no air fresheners, and definitely no plumbing in most homes. Well, unless you're a millionaire senator. Spoiler, you're not. You try to stretch, and immediately regret it. Your back sounds like someone stepping on dry twigs. You're 25 years old, which means you're edging toward your Roman midlife crisis. Your joints crack, your teeth ache, and your stomach's already starting to grumble. But first, nature calls, and in ancient Rome, that's a whole different kind of horror show. Forget the cosy little bathroom. You're heading to the latrine, a long bench of holes over a shared channel of running water where you sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers. Think public restrooms today are bad. Imagine trying to have a private moment while the guy next to you discusses grain prices. No toilet paper either. Romans used a sponge on a stick, dunked in vinegar between uses. Communal, sponge, on, a stick. If that visual didn't kill your appetite, breakfast will. You don't get coffee, you don't get bacon, you get pulse. A sad beige porridge made from spelt or barley, boiled until it's the consistency of sadness itself. If you're lucky, you might get a chunk of stale bread, maybe some olives if it's a good day. Water, maybe if you trust it, but most people just drank weak wine mixed with water to kill the germs. 6 in the morning? Too bad. Bottoms up. And no, you're not lounging around in a toga. That's ceremonial wear. Daily clothing is simpler and smellier. A rough tunic tied at the waist, already stained from a dozen things you'd rather not identify. Washing your clothes means scrubbing them in lye and urine. Yes, pee was a literal cleaning agent. Even worse, laundry was often a public job done by slaves who stomped on the clothes in vats of human waste. So enjoy that fresh scent clinging to your body all day. Now, you're dressed, underfed, and clinging to a thin hope you won't be eaten alive by lice before noon. Ready for work? Too bad. Your day's just getting started. Yes, you can be executed for picking up the wrong stick from the wrong forest. Under Roman law, the forests, rivers, and even certain types of fish belonged to the state or to the emperor himself. Wood was critical for survival, to build, to heat, to cook, but stealing even fallen branches from imperial land could be seen as theft against the emperor. Punishments? Harsh and very public. A flogging at minimum, forced labour in the mines if you were unlucky. Death if you were seen as a repeat offender. The mines, by the way, were a death sentence themselves, a place so brutal that slaves prayed for a quick end. Inside your Roman domus, if you were lucky enough to own one, or more likely your cramped insular apartment, life wasn't glamorous. Rome was crowded, painfully so. Think of tens of thousands of people packed into apartment blocks so rickety that fires were constant and entire buildings collapsed regularly, crushing dozens underneath. The higher up you lived, the poorer you were. 5th or 6th floor, you were one heavy rainstorm away from death when the walls gave out. There were no elevators. You hauled your water, your grain, your firewood up endless flights of stairs. Winter inside the city was brutal in a different way. Rome's Mediterranean climate didn't mean endless sunshine. Rain flooded the muddy streets, chilling you through your thin wool tunic. Heating? Maybe a small brazier of coals if you could afford it, and with the ever-present risk of carbon monoxide poisoning because ventilation was non-existent. Shivering under a single worn blanket, you slept with rats nibbling at the edges of your mattress, or your toes if you were too still. And then there's the water. The aqueducts brought in clean water, in theory. But once it hit the public fountains and cisterns, contamination was rampant. Waste ran freely through the streets. Public latrines existed, yes, but privacy didn't. You sat elbow to elbow with strangers on long stone benches with holes carved into them, chatting about the weather while flies buzzed around the filth. Romans wiped themselves with a communal sponge on a stick, dunked in dirty vinegar water between uses. You can imagine how many infections began right there. Summer in Rome was a different nightmare. Without air circulation, the air hung heavy with the smell of sweat, garbage, human waste, and death. Disease stalked the alleyways, malaria, typhoid, and countless unnamed fevers. Corpses of the poor sometimes rotted where they fell, because burial fees were expensive and no one claimed the dead unless they had to. Vermin thrived in the heat, and the stench of the Tiber River, clogged with refuse and rot, thickened the air even more. Food was survival, not pleasure. If you lived in the countryside, your diet was hard bread, olives, lentils, and whatever vegetables you could grow. Maybe salted fish if you were close to the coast. In the city, the grain dole, the anana, kept the poorest citizens alive. Free or subsidised grain, handed out by the state to prevent mass riots. Bread baked from this was often adulterated with sand or chalk to stretch supplies. Your teeth wore down prematurely, scraping against hidden grit in every bite. Meat? A rare luxury for most. A tough, sinewy cut from a half-rotted carcass at best. More often, you ate what we might now call variety meats. Intestines, feet, snouts. Anything that could be boiled or roasted into something vaguely edible. Medicine? A wild gamble. Roman doctors had some knowledge. surgery for battlefield wounds, herbal remedies, and primitive dental work. But for the average Roman, medicine was a mix of superstition and guesswork. A snake bite might be treated by tying a dead rooster to the wound. A headache could earn you a poultice of crushed worms. Bleeding was considered good for many illnesses. If you were sick and poor, your chances weren't good. And if you were rich, your chances weren't much better, just more expensive. Marriage? It wasn't about romance. It was about alliances, family reputation, property. Girls often married at 12 or 13, boys a few years later. Fathers arranged matches based on dowry size and political advantage. Divorce was common, shockingly so compared to later societies, but the motives were practical, not emotional. If a better marriage opportunity arose, a letter of divorce could be delivered casually with a few witnesses. Marriage, love, and sex were almost completely separated concepts for the Romans, especially among the elites. Crime. Roman cities swarmed with thieves, conmen, and cutthroats. The city patrols, the vigils, tried to keep order, but the back alleys belonged to the gangs. Punishments were harsh and very visible: flogging, branding, exile, crucifixion. Public executions were spectacles, meant to terrify the masses into obedience. Slaves could be tortured not because they were guilty, but just in case they knew something about a crime their master committed. Slavery wasn't just a feature of Roman life, it was the engine. Rome didn't function without slaves. Not in the fields, not in the houses, not in the streets. Slaves made up about a third of the entire population. In cities like Rome itself, slaves outnumbered free citizens. Some were born into slavery, others were prisoners of war, debtors, or victims of piracy. You could be kidnapped from the fringes of the empire and wake up sold at auction in the heart of Rome. A price tag hung around your neck. Slavery could mean anything. You could be a galley slave chained to an oar, rowing until your heart exploded. You could be a farmhand breaking your back under the hot sun, whipped for moving too slow. Or, if you were lucky, very lucky, you might end up as a domestic slave in a wealthy house, cleaning, cooking, tutoring children. Somehow slaves earned trust, small freedoms, even manumission. The chance to buy or be granted their own freedom after years of service. But even in the finest houses, you were property, a thing. If you were beaten, mutilated, raped, or killed, there was no justice for you, only replacement. Entertainment in Rome was soaked in blood. The games, ludi, were not rare events. They happened constantly. Gladiator fights, animal hunts, public executions staged as mythological plays. The Colosseum alone could seat around 50,000 people. Imagine the roar of that crowd as two men, trained killers, hacked each other to pieces with short swords. Not all gladiators fought to the death. They were expensive investments, but death was always an option if the crowd demanded it. And when criminals were executed, it wasn't just a beheading or a hanging, it was a spectacle. Condemned men might be thrown to wild beasts or forced to reenact myths, like being tied to a wooden bull and burned alive while dressed as a mythological villain. People loved it. Senators, commoners, slaves, all sat side by side howling for blood. For many Romans, life was so grim that watching others die was a release, a brutal reassurance that they had survived another day. Women in Rome had more visibility than in many ancient cultures, but little real power. Legally, a woman was under the authority of her father or her husband for most of her life. Only a rare few, usually very wealthy widows, had genuine independence. Most Roman women married young, bore children, managed households. Some educated women wrote poetry, studied philosophy, even ran businesses. But for most, life was a tight circle of domestic duty and social expectation. A Roman woman's reputation, her pudicitia, her modesty and virtue, was everything. Public shame could destroy an entire family's honour. A woman could be divorced simply for being seen talking too casually with another man in public. There were no second chances. Children had no protected innocence. Boys were expected to become miniature adults early. At age 7, a Roman boy often began formal education if his family could afford it, learning Greek, Latin, rhetoric, philosophy. By 14, he was training for public life. Sons of farmers. They worked from the moment they could carry a tool. Girls were even less coddled. taught to spin wool, manage servants, obey their fathers. By puberty, they were expected to be ready for marriage, childbirth, motherhood, and there were many who didn't make it that far. Infant mortality was staggering. Estimates suggest nearly half of Roman children died before the age of 10. Diseases, accidents, poor sanitation. Every day was a battle for survival, and if you were born unwanted, wrong gender, wrong time, wrong father, you might simply be abandoned. Left outside the city gates, exposed to the elements, to animals, to death. Sometimes poor families did it out of desperation. Sometimes rich families did it to correct the shape of their airlines. There were no social services. Mercy depended on luck, or the kindness of strangers. Education wasn't a guarantee of a better life either. For many poor Roman boys, school was a rare luxury. Instead, they learned trades from their fathers: masonry, carpentry, blacksmithing, farming. For most Romans, literacy was partial at best. Enough to sign your name, maybe read a price list. True classical education, learning Cicero, Virgil, Plato, that belonged to the elite. Meanwhile, everyday life was under constant watch of invisible forces, omens, curses, portents. A dead crow in the road, bad luck. A dream about fire, a warning. Superstition was deeply woven into life. Amulets, spells, charms. Common tools for ordinary Romans trying to fend off the chaos they couldn't understand. Joining the Roman army wasn't just a career move, it was a contract with blood. Roman soldiers, legionaries, signed up for at least 25 years of service. 25 years? Imagine that. Most recruits were teenagers. Few would live to see retirement. Training was brutal from day one. Marches of over 30 kilometers a day, wearing full armor, chainmail, helmet, shield, sword, sometimes more than 30 kilograms of gear. Punishments for slacking were severe: flogging, extra labor, even death if you deserted or showed cowardice. Discipline wasn't just harsh, it was religious. Every soldier became part of a machine. They drilled endlessly: how to form ranks, how to hold a line under arrow fire, how to build a fortified camp in a single day. Roman camps weren't just tents thrown up on a hill. They were mini-cities, surrounded by trenches, palisades, roads laid out in strict grids. Soldiers could be building all day, fighting all night, and marching by morning. No complaints tolerated. And when it came to actual battle, Rome's enemies feared the army with good reason. The legions didn't fight like frenzied barbarians. They fought like surgeons, slow, relentless, precise. Tight formations, shield walls, short stabbing swords. They advanced like a wall of knives. No mercy for the defeated. Surrendering towns were sometimes spared. Often, they were massacred or sold wholesale into slavery. Total destruction, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed, wasn't just rhetoric. It was Roman policy. The army wasn't only Romans, though. The farther the empire expanded, the more it filled its ranks with auxiliaries. Foreigners promised citizenship after their service. Syrian archers, Numidian cavalry, Germanic scouts. They bled for Rome, and many of them died without ever being recognized as true Romans. And what about death? For soldiers, and for most Romans, death wasn't terrifying. It was expected. It was everywhere. Romans had a complicated relationship with death and the afterlife. They didn't dream of heaven. The traditional belief was that after death your spirit, or your manes, passed into the underworld, a shadowy place ruled by Pluto and Proserpina. It wasn't about reward or punishment, it was just existence in a dimmer world. But the living had responsibilities. If your family didn't perform the right funeral rituals, the cremation, the prayers, the offerings, your spirit could become a lemur, a restless ghost. Unquiet dead were feared. A house haunted by a lemur could be abandoned, left to rot, because Romans believed these ghosts could harm the living. This fear shaped life. Every year in May, during the festival of Lemuria, Romans performed private rituals at home to appease any angry spirits. They would walk barefoot through their house at midnight, throwing black beans over their shoulders while chanting, "With these beans, I redeem me and mine," trying to bribe the dead to leave them in peace. Burial was sacred. By law, Romans could not bury the dead inside the city walls. Instead, tombs lined the roads outside the city, literal streets of the dead. Rich families built towering monuments. Poor people pooled money into collective graves called columbaria, niches where urns were stored together. And if you were a soldier who died far from home, maybe you got a quick grave by the roadside marked by a simple stone, maybe nothing at all. But no matter who you were, you wanted to be remembered. The worst fate in Roman thinking wasn't death, it was being forgotten. To die without descendants, without a tomb, without a name carved in stone, that was true death. Food in Rome wasn't grand banquets every day. For the vast majority, the urban poor, farmers, soldiers, daily meals were simple, repetitive, and frankly pretty grim. The staple food was pulse, a kind of porridge made from barley, wheat, or spelt. Thick, bland, sometimes flavoured with a splash of olive oil or a sprinkle of salt, if you could afford it. Meat? Rare. Only the wealthy ate beef, pork, or lamb regularly. The poor made do with beans, onions, lentils, and maybe, if luck was with them, a scrap of fish or a handful of olives. Bread was king. Cheap, filling, portable, essential for survival. In Rome itself, massive public bakeries churned out coarse loaves day and night. Grain was distributed to citizens through the annona, Rome's grain dole, the ancient equivalent of food stamps. Without it, tens of thousands would have starved. Wine was everywhere, but don't picture fine Bordeaux. Roman wine, especially what the poor drank, was rough, sour, often watered down and cut with honey or even seawater to kill the taste. Drunkenness wasn't exactly frowned upon either. It was part of daily life for many. Spoiled food was common. Without refrigeration, food spoiled fast, especially in the Mediterranean heat. Romans tried to mask rot with heavy spices, vinegar, or fermentation. Fish sauce, garum, was a staple. A salty fermented liquid made from fish guts rotting in the sun. They poured it on everything. Sanitation was, in theory, better than in many later societies, but the reality was brutal. Rome's aqueducts were engineering marvels, delivering fresh water into public fountains, baths, and homes if you were rich. Public baths were the pride of Roman civilization, open daily to men and women at different times, offering hot pools, cold plunges, saunas, massages. But these baths were also bacterial hotbeds. Water wasn't regularly changed. People relieved themselves directly in the pools. Skin diseases, lice, and eye infections were rampant. Bath attendants used strigils, metal scrapers, to clean off oil and dirt from customers, but these were often reused without cleaning between people. Imagine the filth building up. Toilets were public too. Rows of stone seats with holes, all above open running water channels. No privacy, no toilet paper either. People wiped with communal sponges on sticks, rinsed between uses in dirty water. Disease was everywhere. Romans understood that cleanliness mattered, but they had no idea about bacteria or viruses. Illness was blamed on bad air, miasma, or angering the gods. Doctors were a mixed bag. Many were Greek slaves or freedmen with no formal training. Treatments included bloodletting, purging, and an astonishing amount of herbal concoctions that mostly did nothing, or actively harmed the patient. Opium and wine were the best anaesthetics available. Surgery was brutal. No anaesthesia beyond alcohol, no sterilisation, no antibiotics. Infection killed far more than the knife did. In the countryside, medicine was even cruder. Faith healers, herbalists, and magic charms were the main options. Life expectancy was short. The average Roman, even counting the elite, probably lived around 25 to 30 years. Childhood was especially dangerous. Roughly half of Roman children died before age 10. Women faced deadly risks from childbirth, and plagues, like the Antonine Plague of the 2nd century AD, could wipe out huge chunks of the population overnight, and yet the city of Rome kept growing. Fed by constant immigration from the countryside, slaves from conquered lands, and the sheer pull of opportunity, even if that opportunity often meant poverty, disease, and back-breaking work. There is a classic saying of all roads lead to Rome. As a tourist or travel junkie, that might mean to you as a calling to go visit the Eternal City, gouging yourself with gelato and cappuccinos, throwing a coin into the Trevi Fountain, and crossing another destination off of your bucket list. However, to ancient Romans, all roads lead to Rome was taken as a literal phrase. To anyone with the slightest knowledge of Roman history, Rome was known as a conqueror. The nation consisted of a strong army, a very wealthy leadership and engineering that surpassed all others. How does a civilization begin to build more off of that? The answer lies within their roads. Reaching vast locations all around the country of Italy, Rome was as interconnected as modern-day cities. Each road built meant more areas to send armies to take over land, generating more wealth and more opportunities. If that doesn't impress you enough, the fact that you're able to visit these roads today should. For example, the Via Appia Antica, the longest and oldest Roman road, is still in use today. Over 2,000 years later, and these roads are still supporting tourists and cars. How are these roads built to last so long? What is an ancient Roman road like today? In this report, I will cover these questions within 3 major sections: the construction of ancient Roman roads, major roads and classifications, and the Via Appia Antica. The greatest example of a well-built road is the ability to visit and walk on it over 2,000 years later. The construction of ancient Roman roads is a guide to a durable craftsmanship and material use, to which most of we still use today. Whether it's been military troops, travellers, animals, weather or tourists, these roads have seen it all. What went into the construction of these roads? Who used them? Why were they built in such specific locations? And what traits do we still use today? The process behind building a Roman road is made out of layers. The crew begins by digging parallel trenches named scoop ditches along the main roadway, keeping retaining walls up on both sides of the new road. These scoop ditches assisted with the structural integrity of the road, helping the road drain when it rains. The storm drains were dug around 40 feet apart. Between the 2 scoop ditches would start the main road. The crew digs a ditch 6 to 9 feet deep while reaching bedrock and firm ground. This ditch is called the fossa. Using leftover earth from digging the storm drains, the crew packs a 3-foot layer into the bottom of the fossa, creating a foundation for the new road. Layered on top of this is sand or dry earth, called the pavimentum, labelled as layer A in figure 1 below, to level the surface. The main construction begins following the 4 common steps of every Roman road: the statumen, rudus, nucleus, and summum dorsum. On top of the pavimentum, the sand layer from previous, is the statumen. The statumen is composed of fist-size rock, averaging at least 2 inches in size. This layer was put down 10 to 24 inches thick. On top of the statumen is the rudus, a 9-inch thick layer of pottery shards or stone gravel mixed with lime mortar, creating a type of concrete. The nucleus is next, a mixture of sand, gravel and lime to create concrete, all compacted together with a roller to sit 12 inches thick. In some cases, the nucleus is the top layer of the road. To finish off the layers is the summum dorsum, a 6-inch layer of wet concrete and large flat stones in lime mortar. This layer has a slight curve to it for drainage purposes and would increase the longevity of the road with weather-related issues. Roman roads were more similar to roads today than we think. They would be lined with curbs built by upright slabs fitted into the sides after the rudus layer to hold the paving stones tightly in. Each road would have mile markers, named miliaria or lapides, to notify travellers to passing 1 Roman mile. 1,000 paces equal to 4,850 feet. These markers were built out of marble or granite, and also listed the official who was in charge of that road section, repairs, and the current emperor or consul. In the Roman Forum, Emperor Augustus had placed a golden milestone, which can be found near the Temple of Saturn. Built by packed gravel, footpaths and sidewalks were included along the sides of the road. Along with these sidewalks was placed a higher block to stop traffic from running into the side. The blocks were placed around 12 feet apart and also assisted travellers to step up and mount horses or pack animals. Busier stretches of roads had areas for travellers to pull over and rest, just like rest stops you see on busy highways today. Along with these pull-off areas were state-run inns, houses for travellers to stay and rest while they were on their journey. These rest stops were called statios and could be found around every 10. Outside the cities, in the towns and on the small farms, people lived a much simpler life, dependent almost entirely on their own labour. The daily life of the average city dweller, however, was a lot different and most often routine. The urban areas of the empire, whether it was Rome, Pompeii, Antioch or Carthage, were magnets to many people who left smaller towns and farms seeking a better way of life. However, the unfulfilled promise of jobs forced countless people to live in the poorer parts of the city. The jobs they sought were often not there, resulting in an epidemic of homeless inhabitants. The work that was available to these new émigrés, however, was difficult to obtain. Slaves performed almost all of the menial jobs as well as many of the professions such as teachers, doctors, surgeons and architects. Most of the freedmen worked at various trades, for example, as bakers, fishmongers or carpenters. Occasionally, poor women would serve the affluent as hairdressers, midwives or dressmakers. As elsewhere, whether on a farm or in the city, daily life still centred on the home, and when people arrived in the city, their first concern was to find a place to live. Space was at a premium in a walled metropolis like Rome, and from the beginning little attention was paid to the housing needs of the people who migrated to the city. Tenements provided the best answer. The majority of Roman citizens, not all of them poor, lived in these apartment buildings or insulae. As early as 150 BCE, there were over 46,000 insulae throughout the city. Most of these ramshackle tenements were overcrowded and extremely dangerous, resulting in residents living in constant fear of fire, collapse, and in some areas there was the susceptibility to the flooding of the Tiber River. Initially, little concern from the city was given to designing straight or even wide streets. Streets, often unpaved, could be as narrow as 6 feet or as wide as 15, not allowing for easy access to these buildings if a fire did occur. It would take the Great Fire under Emperor Nero to improve this problem when streets were widened and balconies built to provide safety as well as access in time of an emergency. These flats were usually 5 to 7 stories in height, over 70 feet. However, because many of these tenements were deemed unsafe, laws were passed under Emperors Augustus and Trajan to keep them from becoming too tall. Unfortunately, these laws were rarely enforced. Poverty throughout the city was apparent, whether through one's lack of education or manner of dress, and life in these tenements reflected this disparity. The floor on which a person lived depended on one's income. The lower apartments, the ground floor or first floor of an insulae, were far more comfortable than the top floors. They were spacious, containing separate rooms for dining and sleeping, glazed windows, and, unlike the other floors, the rent was usually paid annually. The higher floors, where rent was paid by the day or week, were cramped, often with only one room to a family. A family lived in constant fear of eviction. They had no access to natural light, were hot in the summer and cold in the winter with little or no running water. This even meant a latrina or toilet. While the city's first sewer system or Cloaca Maxima had appeared in the 6th century BCE, it did not benefit those on the upper floors. Lower floors had access to running water and indoor toilets. Refuse, even human waste, was routinely dumped onto the streets, not only causing a terrible stench, but a breeding ground for disease. For many, the only alternative was to use the public toilets. Combine the lack of street lights. There was no foot traffic at night due to the high crime rate, the decaying buildings and the fear of fire. Life on the upper floors of the tenements was not very enjoyable for many of the poor. On the contrary, most of the wealthy residents, those who didn't live in villas outside the city, lived in a domus. These homes, at least in Rome, were usually located on Palatine Hill to be close to the imperial palace. As with many of the tenements, the front of this dwelling, especially in cities like Pompeii and Herculaneum, often contained a shop where the owner would conduct daily business. Behind the shop was the atrium, a reception area where guests or clients were greeted and private business sometimes conducted. The atrium would often include a small shrine to a household or ancestral god. The ceiling of the atrium was open, and beneath this was a rectangular pool. On rainy days, the water that came through this opening was collected and used elsewhere in the domus. On either side of the atrium were smaller rooms called cubiculum, which served as bedrooms, libraries and offices. Of course, there was ample space available for a dining room or triclinium in the kitchen. To the rear of the domus was the family garden. A tradition stemming from the earlier Etruscans, gladiators appeared in Rome in 264 BCE. Gladiatorial games embodied the broader social context of their time. A gladiator was either a slave or a criminal, and the games were a way to redeem themselves from their criminal charges or fight for their freedom. The games quickly became a political tool. Gladiators provided a spectacle under controlled, albeit brutal, conditions to deter viewers from enacting the same crimes that had condemned the gladiators to the arena. Essentially, those who abused the social order would suffer the same brutality in front of hundreds of Roman civilians who valued a pervasive culture of violence. Originally, gladiatorial games were an homage to the dead. Armed combat was a funerary tribute to the dead, a kind of blood sacrifice believed to placate the dead. The first recorded gladiatorial funeral rite was for Junius Brutus Pera in 264 BCE. However, as time passed, the games lost their ceremonial purpose. They became increasingly performative, warping into a form of sport-related entertainment. In 105 BCE, the consuls P. Rutilius Rufus and Quintus Manilius Maximus arranged games for their political campaigns. From then on, the games became a way for politicians to curry favour with the public. The promise of being re-elected was stronger if they sponsored the games generously. By the end of the Republic, the games were so costly that Marcus Tullius Cicero passed a law that prohibited public figures from offering gladiatorial combat in the 2 years preceding their election to public office. Most gladiators were recruited from two groups: slaves and free volunteers. Slaves had no choice when becoming gladiators. Their master would sell them to a gladiatorial agent. Meanwhile, a volunteer signed himself to one. Consequently, a volunteer would surrender his civilian rights and consent to the violence he would inevitably experience in the arena. Unlike a slave, a volunteer received a signing bonus and the prospect of prize money if they won a battle, and his chances of glory advanced with every successful fight. A slave, if they served a minimum of 3 years, would be granted their freedom. Yet, this seldom occurred, as most slave gladiators died in the arena, or served out the remainder of their lives as gladiators. The other subgroup from which gladiators were drawn were criminals. In ancient Rome, a criminal would either be condemned to the sword, ad gladium, or condemned to the training school, ad in ludum. While in most cases both were death sentences, by becoming a gladiator, the criminal could survive their sentence and win their freedom. Gladiators trained within a ludus gladiatorius, an institution managed by a lanista. Some ludus, however, were owned by wealthy investors who housed and trained troops of gladiators, a familia gladiatoria. In smaller gladiatorial establishments, the lanista doubled as a trainer, whereas in larger, more renowned training schools such as the Ludus Magnus, a magistra taught specific types of gladiatorial combat. The lanista ran the business side of the schools, leasing out the gladiators to wealthy nobles for gladiatorial shows, or munus. Superior gladiators with excellent weaponry skills were more expensive to hire, and these men were typically volunteer gladiators. Working under contract, however, was no different to the regime a slave followed in the gladiatorial schools. Both were beaten, whipped, and renounced their social privileges. As a gladiator, slave, or contracted, they were fundamentally social outcasts. Within the confines of the school, the gladiators trained at different posts. These followed a hierarchical rank from primus palus, the first post, right through to the 8th stratum, the lowest ranking. At the Carnuntum and the Ludus Magnus, the inside was shaped like an arena, which mimicked the landscape of the stadium. In Pompeii, the training arena was more rectangular. The type of training a gladiator received was based on their suitability and aptitude for specific armatures. Gladiatorial combat was a performative spectacle, as much as a brutal display of strength and vigilance. Recruits were, therefore, trained according to the type of combat spectators would most enjoy, and trainers could pick out which of the men were better suited for different types of combat. Various types of blows and techniques were taught at the Ludus Gladiatorius. There was a horizontal stab, punctim, and the chop, chisim, which required the gladiator to raise their arm during close combat. Finally, there was a variation of the punctim, which was a reverse grip on the sword, stabbing downwards as though the blade were a dagger. Gladiators were taught to master lethal weaponry skills to the extent that a shallow 49mm deep wound was fatal. Of course, killing their opponent too soon or without a drawn-out bloody battle would make for a poor show in the arena. On the flip side, if the show went for too long, the gladiators ran the risk of displeasing the crowd. Knowing how to use their weapon effectively and performatively was paramount. The standard of living was subpar for a gladiator. Men were housed in cramped quarters with several to a cell, sleeping on either cots or mattresses on the floor. The two gladiatorial schools in Pompeii were said to be relatively airy and open, unlike the congested pens of the Ludus Magnus and Carnuntum in Rome. Gladiators followed a carbohydrate-heavy diet to support their training, and because wheat and barley were relatively inexpensive. Dinner consisted of a heavy gruel of beans and barley, which was called sagina, but amongst the gladiators, this was known as hordeari or barley men. Originally, the games occurred at irregular intervals throughout the year, typically when the Romans believed it necessary to pacify the wrath of a god. By the end of the Republic, however, historians contend there were 67 days allocated for games each year. If there were animal displays, they were presented in the morning before the gladiatorial combats began in the afternoon. Public executions via large animals such as lions or bears would have taken place in the morning. Gladiatorial contests occurred one pair at a time, and both opponents were matched based on their skill and size. They would enter the arena slowly so that the audience had the chance to size them up and hedge their bets on the winner. Then, without further stalling, the gladiators would fight until one of them won. The gladiators ensured they didn't finish the duel too quickly, as it was ultimately a performative contest. Audiences wanted to witness a stylish, technical fight. To entertain the crowd beyond their swordsmanship, gladiators were adorned in different regalia, based on the tribe from which they originated. A popular battle was between the Samnite and the Retiarius. The Samnite wore a plumed helmet, carried an oblong shield, and a sword was his weapon of choice. The Retiarius wore no helmet but had an armlet on his left arm to protect his head from a side blow. Retiarius defended themselves with a large net and a long trident or spear. Combat rarely ended with a death, unless the show had been advertised as a munus sine missione, a fight to the death. For a gladiator to surrender to their opponent, they would sink to the ground and raise a finger as a gesture of submission. His fate then was decided by the host of the show. The show host would receive a discount on every uninjured gladiator they returned to the school. Unless the gladiator was a convicted criminal condemned to death, it was cheaper to keep the gladiator alive. The chariot races were held in a circus arena with a racing floor, and most races required 7 laps. On race days, 24 races were run, and the games commenced with a solemn procession, starting at the Capitol and descending through the arena gates between the carceres. The procession was led by the presiding magistrate, and in his wake followed the competitors and images of the gods. Between the races, orchestral performances and trick riders, such as the Desultores, who leapt from one horse to another, dazzled the crowds. The Colosseum Games, first held under the Emperor Titus in 80 CE, showcased some of the most extravagant gladiatorial combats ever. 2 naval battles, Naumachia, were held at the Colosseum close to the date of its inauguration. Colossal lakes were excavated within the arena to mimic the naval landscape of famous battles like the Corcyraeans destroying the Corinthian fleet. Often, the naval ships were filled with criminals rather than trained gladiators, and Naumachia was a form of public execution. Archaeologists have discovered holding cells beneath the Colosseum designed to release wild beasts into the arena. This form of brutalistic performance was known as venaciones. They were introduced when Italian expansion came into contact with Africa in the east. The Roman general Fulvius Nobilia was the first to exhibit a wild beast show in 186 BCE in celebration of his victory over the Aetolians. In later years, the hosts of the shows relied upon eastern governors to supply them with a variety of animals for the games, including panthers, lions, and even rhinoceroses. If accounts from antiquity were true, 9,000 animals were slaughtered in a single show, either in fights between animals or hunted by one or more armed Roman huntsmen. Historians speculate that this number was vastly overestimated. Nonetheless, this number implies that large numbers of exotic animals were killed for the sake of entertainment. Venaciones were highly popular during the Empire and were a favoured form of capital punishment. Lions and bears were set upon criminals in the arena, and audiences would flock to the stadium to witness their execution. Romans valued justice in whatever violent form it took. Winning gladiators were crowned with a laurel and sometimes given a purse of coins, which was divided with their lanista. Marcus Aurelius set the dividends at 25% of the purse if free, and 20% for slaves. Experienced gladiators were known as veterans, and once they accrued enough wins, they could aspire to reach the status of primus palis, or first stake. Eventually, after serving their time and forging their career with the school, they could retire. Receiving the rudies, a wooden sword marked the end of their time in the arena. In rare cases, slaves who had worked their way up the gladiatorial hierarchy within the school were free to open their own businesses or move into the security trade, particularly during the tumultuous period of the late Republic. The Colosseum, alternatively known as the Flavian Amphitheatre, is arguably Rome's most well-known monument. The elliptical structure that spans 6 acres signifies the presence and importance of Roman engineering, tying in multiple engineering concepts within its structure. After first seeing the Colosseum, I was immediately drawn to the repeated concrete arches lining the perimeter. Knowing that the Colosseum served as a main source of entertainment for the people in the heart of the city, I was intrigued by the scale of the project and the vulgar practices that were seen as entertainment and power. The building itself once defined religion and culture for the Roman community. The striking appearance of the building was breathtaking, and I knew I wanted to study the Roman Empire's largest amphitheatre further. After viewing the exterior multiple times, taking an in-depth tour, then doing extensive literature and online research on the subject, I was able to learn and apply concepts about the history, construction, engineering, restoration, and modern-day use of the Roman Colosseum. Colosseum, giant amphitheatre built in Rome under the Flavian emperors. Construction of the Colosseum was begun sometime between 70 and 72 CE during the reign of Vespasian. It is located just east of the Palatine Hill, on the grounds of what was Nero's Golden House. The artificial lake that was the centrepiece of that palace complex was drained, and the Colosseum was sited there, a decision that was as much symbolic as it was practical. Vespasian, whose path to the throne had relatively humble beginnings, chose to replace the tyrannical emperor's private lake with a public amphitheatre that could host tens of thousands of Romans. The structure was officially dedicated in 80 CE by Titus, in a ceremony that included 100 days of games. Later, in 82 CE, Domitian completed the work by adding the uppermost story. Unlike earlier amphitheatres, which were nearly all dug into convenient hillsides for extra support, the Colosseum is a freestanding structure of stone and concrete, using a complex system of barrel vaults and groin vaults, and measuring 620 by 513 feet, 189 by 156 metres, overall. 3 of the arena's stories are encircled by arcades framed on the exterior by engaged columns in the Doric, Ionic and Corinthian orders. The structure's rising arrangement of columns became the basis of the Renaissance codification known as the assemblage of orders. The main structural framework and facade are travertine, the secondary walls are volcanic tufa, and the inner bowl and the arcade vaults are concrete. The amphitheatre seated some 50,000 spectators, who were shielded from the sun by a massive retractable velarium awning. Supporting masts extended from corbels built into the Colosseum's top, or attic story, and hundreds of Roman sailors were required to manipulate the rigging that extended and retracted the velarium. The Colosseum was the scene of thousands of hand-to-hand combats between gladiators, of contests between men and animals, and of many larger combats, including mock naval engagements. However, it is uncertain whether the arena was the site of the martyrdom of early Christians. In medieval times, the Colosseum was used as a church, then as a fortress by two prominent Roman families, the Frangipani and the Annibaldi. The Colosseum was damaged by lightning and earthquakes, and even more severely by vandalism and pollution. All the marble seats and decorative materials disappeared, as the site was treated as little more than a quarry for more than 1,000 years. Preservation of the Colosseum began in earnest in the 19th century, with notable efforts led by Pius VIII, and a restoration project was undertaken in the 1990s. It has long been one of Rome's major tourist attractions, receiving close to 7 million visitors annually. Changing exhibitions relating to the culture of ancient Rome are regularly mounted. A period of unrest and civil wars in the 1st century BCE marked the transition of Rome from a republic to an empire. This period encompassed the career of Julius Caesar, who eventually took full power over Rome as its dictator. After his assassination in 44 BCE, the triumvirate of Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian, Caesar's nephew, ruled. It was not long before Octavian went to war against Antony in northern Africa, and after his victory at Actium, 31 BCE, he was crowned Rome's first emperor Augustus. His reign, from 27 BCE to 14 CE, was distinguished by stability and peace. Augustus established a form of government known as a principate, which combined some elements from the Republic with the traditional powers of a monarchy. The Senate still functioned, though Augustus, as princeps, or first citizen, remained in control of the government. With a mind toward maintaining the structure of power entrusted to his rule, Augustus began thinking early about who should follow him. Death played havoc with his attempts to select his successor. He had no son, and his nephew Marcellus, his son-in-law Agrippa, and his grandsons Gaius and Lucius each predeceased him. He eventually chose Tiberius, a scion of the ultra-aristocratic Claudia Gens, and in 4 CE adopted him as his son. Tiberius, reigned 14 to 37, became the first successor in the Julio-Claudian dynasty and ruled as an able administrator but cruel tyrant. His great-nephew Caligula, 37 to 41, reigned as an absolutist, his short reign filled with reckless spending, callous murders, and humiliation of the Senate. Claudius, 41 to 54, centralized state finances in the imperial household, thus making rapid strides in organizing the imperial bureaucracy, but was ruthless toward the senators and equites. Nero, 54 to 68, left administration to capable advisors for a few years, but then asserted himself as a vicious despot. He brought the dynasty to its end by being the first emperor to suffer damnatio memoriae. His reign was officially stricken from the record by order of the Senate. Following a war of succession, Vespasian became emperor, and the Flavian dynasty was established. His reign, 69 to 79, was noted for his reorganization of the army, making it more loyal and professional, for his expansion of the membership of the Senate, bringing in administrators with a sense of service, for his increase and systematization of taxation, and for his strengthening of the frontiers of the empire, though little new territory was added. The brief but popular reign of his son Titus, 79 to 81, was followed by the autocracy of Domitian, 81 to 96, Vespasian's other son, who fought the senatorial class and instituted taxes and confiscations for costly buildings, games, and shows. A reign of terror in his final years was ended by his assassination. The Flavian dynasty, like the Julio-Claudian, ended with an emperor whose memory was officially damned. Domitian was succeeded by an elderly senator of some distinction, Marcus Cotzius Nerva, 96 to 98. Among the beloved rulers of Rome that succeeded him were Trajan, reigned 98 to 117, Hadrian, 117 to 138, Antoninus Pius, 138 to 161, and Marcus Aurelius, 161 to 180. Together these are known as the Five Good Emperors. Their non-hereditary succession oversaw a golden age, which witnessed a considerable amount of expansion and consolidation. But all the changes that occurred during this era, beneficial as they were, brought with them the attendant evils of excessive centralization. The concentration of an empire in the hands of an emperor like Commodus, 180 to 192, juvenile, incompetent and decadent, was enough to steer it toward decline. The following century was plagued by strife and mismanagement. When the commander of